She showed up in civilian clothes, carrying a battered rifle case and sealed orders no one bothered to read. Colonel Marcus Hale looked her over for exactly 4 seconds. Then he pointed at the gate. In front of 40 of the most decorated marksmen in the U.S. military, he told her to leave. She didn't argue. She didn't flinch. She just stepped aside, set her case down in the gravel, and watched the desert like she was reading something the rest of them couldn't see. 2 hours later, a 3-star general would land on that range, walk past Hale without a word, and salute her. If you've ever been dismissed before you could prove yourself, stay until the end. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. You will not want to miss what happens next. The Nevada desert in July was not a forgiving place. By 9 in the morning, the temperature at Iron Mesa Joint Warfare Center had already climbed past 94 degrees, and the air coming off the flat smelled like baked copper and engine exhaust. The Joshua trees along the perimeter fence stood absolutely still. There was no wind, or at least that's what the range instruments read. Later, that particular detail would matter quite a lot. Iron Mesa wasn't a standard military installation. It didn't appear on any public map. Its primary function, the selection and advanced development of long-range precision shooters for Tier 1 special operations, was listed in no brochure, explained in no recruitment conversation. You didn't apply to go there. You were sent. And being sent meant someone with stars on their collar believed you were already exceptional. That morning, 41 operators had gathered on the main qualification range. They came from Ranger battalions, from Marine Force Recon, from SEAL teams, from Army Special Forces groups scattered across 4 different theater commands. A few had combat deployments that ran into the double digits. Most had sniper certifications already. They were not here because they were good. They were here because every conventional measure had already confirmed they were among the best. Staff Sergeant Noah Pierce stood near the center of the firing line, running a small piece of microfiber cloth along the receiver of his rifle for the 3rd time that morning. Not because it needed cleaning. It was a habit, something his hands did when his brain was working on a problem he hadn't fully identified yet. The problem currently was the wind. Iron Mesa's main range ran south by southwest along a natural valley cut between 2 rocky ridgelines. The distance markers started at 500 meters and pushed out to 2,200. Today's qualification required clean engagement at 2,000. The range safety officer had posted a wind call at the beginning of the session. 6 miles per hour, left to right, consistent. And for the first 40 minutes of the morning, nothing had contradicted that. But Noah had noticed something in the last 20 minutes that didn't quite fit. The mirage off the hardpan wasn't moving the way a steady 6-mile crosswind should produce. It was doing something more complicated, something layered. He hadn't said anything yet. He was still watching. Colonel Marcus Hale arrived at the range at 0922, 2 minutes behind schedule, which put him in the particular kind of mood that radiated outward and made everyone in a 50-yard radius stand slightly straighter. Hale was 51 years old, built like a man who had never stopped competing with his own younger self, and possessed of a command presence that could silence a room the way a dropped rifle could. Sudden, absolute, requiring no explanation. His record was legitimate. He'd commanded sniper elements in 3 different theaters, had written doctrine that was still being used, and had a teaching philosophy built on a simple premise. Standards existed for a reason, and anything that softened them was eventually going to get someone killed. He did not believe in exceptions. He believed exceptions were the first step toward institutional collapse. He walked the line, stopping briefly behind each shooter, saying nothing unless he had something specific to correct. He checked data books. He noted wind holds. He examined scope settings with the practiced eye of someone who had done this thousands of times. A few operators got a single word of approval. Most got nothing. Nothing, from Hale, was considered acceptable. He was midway down the line when the sound reached him. Gravel shifting under tires, and the low idle of a vehicle decelerating at the range entrance. He turned. A government pool SUV had stopped at the gate. The driver said something to the range guard, and the guard checked a clipboard, made a call on the radio, and after a brief conversation that Hale couldn't hear from where he stood, waved the vehicle through. It parked at the near end of the gravel lot. One person got out. She was maybe 5'4", possibly 5'5", somewhere in her early 40s, though nothing about her made that easy to pin down. She wore clean civilian clothes, khaki trousers, a plain gray long sleeve despite the heat, and low trail boots that had seen serious mileage. Her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested practical preference, not any particular attention to appearance. She carried two things: a worn nylon rifle case with stress marks along the spine that suggested it had been packed and unpacked hundreds of times in conditions that hadn't been gentle, and a sealed tan envelope of the kind used for orders classified above routine access. She moved without hurry, crossed the gravel toward the firing line with the unhurried certainty of someone who had walked onto ranges that made this one look recreational. She stopped approximately 6 feet from Colonel Hale, who had turned to face her. She extended the envelope. "Chief Warrant Officer Evelyn Cross," she said. Her voice was level, not loud. "I have sealed deployment orders addressed to the range commander. I've been tasked to observe and participate in the qualification block." Hale looked at the envelope. He looked at her. He did not take the envelope. 41 operators had gone still in the way that people go still when they recognize the particular quality of silence that precedes something worth watching. Even the ones downrange who couldn't have heard the conversation were picking up on it through the body language of the men standing closer. Hale clasped his hands behind his back. "Chief Warrant Officer." "Sir?" "This is a closed selection course. Participants were briefed and credentialed in advance through the program office. I don't have you on my manifest." "I understand that, sir. The orders explain the situation. If you open—" "I've run this program for 3 years," Hale said. "In those 3 years, I've had 19 requests from various commands to insert observers, evaluators, and—" he paused on the word with visible deliberateness— "guests. I've denied all 19. This range operates under program security protocols, not general access. You understand that?" "Sir, if you'll read the orders, who sent you?" Brief pause. "I'm not able to state that verbally, sir. It's in the orders." Something shifted in Hale's expression. Not anger exactly, but the particular quality of patience running out. "Ms. Cross, I don't know what office sent you or what they told you about how this works. What I know is that I have 41 personnel on my range, running a qualification that took 6 months to assemble. I am not stopping that evolution to read unauthorized paperwork and sort out whatever administrative error landed you here." He gestured once toward the gate. "The program office is in Building 14 on the other side of the installation. They can sort it out." Evelyn held the envelope out for another 2 seconds. Then she lowered it. "Understood," she said. She did not leave. She stepped to the right, off the firing line, past the last prepared position, to a strip of open ground near the range's eastern berm. She set her rifle case down on the gravel with the careful deliberateness of someone who had done it on worse surfaces. She sat on a low concrete block that served no current purpose and had probably been part of a frame that no longer existed. She set the sealed envelope on her knee, and she watched the range. Hale stared at her for a moment. One of his range cadre, Master Sergeant Dennis Rourke, materialized at his elbow. Rourke was Hale's senior NCO and had the diplomatic instincts of a person who had survived long by being very good at reading which problems his commander wanted solved and which ones he wanted to solve himself. "Sir, should I—" "Leave her," Hale said, quiet and tight. "She'll get bored and leave." He turned back to the line. "All right, let's get back on the gun. Ceasefire is in 4 hours, and we have 41 qualifications to run." Noah Pierce had watched the whole thing from his position at Station 9. He hadn't intended to. He'd kept his eyes mostly downrange, the way you were supposed to. But the conversation had carried, and the image of her walking to that concrete block and simply sitting down, not angry, not embarrassed, just sitting, had lodged in his brain the way certain things did when they didn't have an obvious explanation. He filed it for later. Right now, he had 2,000 meters of desert to worry about. The morning's qualification block ran with the mechanical rhythm of a well-organized exercise. The range safety officer issued commands. Shooters cycled through prepared positions, making their data entries, dialing their adjustments, acquiring and engaging steel at distance. The report of each rifle cracked across the valley and faded. And slowly, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the incremental stubbornness of something real, the misses began to accumulate. Not for everyone at once. First, it was a corpsman from SEAL Team 7 who hit his first target clean at 1,800 meters, then drifted 3 shots wide on the 2,000 target and couldn't explain why. Then a ranger from 2nd Battalion put 2 rounds off-plate on a target he should have hit on the first. Then a Marine Force recon sergeant had his entire second string go erratic. The RSO started getting busy. Hale moved down the line with increased focus, stopping behind each shooter who called a miss, looking through spotting scopes, asking questions. Call your wind. 6 to 8, sir. Left to right at the line. Your data? 0.8 milliradians, sir. Then why are you hitting 3 mils right of 0? No good answer. Because the data was right. The wind call was right. And the shot was still wrong. By 1100, 7 of the first 11 shooters to run the 2,000-meter stage had recorded misses that their data shouldn't have produced. Hale was no longer simply observing. He was troubleshooting out loud, his voice carrying the particular edge it got when something wasn't cooperating with his understanding of it. Somebody want to tell me why the best long-range shooters in the American military can't hold center on a static target at 2,000? Nobody answered because the honest answer was that nobody knew. Noah was scheduled for the afternoon block. He spent the lunch break at his position, databook open, running numbers. He'd already run twice and getting the same answer. The numbers were right. The environment was wrong. Something about the air between the line and the target wasn't behaving the way the instruments were reporting. He kept looking at the woman on the concrete block. She hadn't moved much in 4 hours. She'd eaten something from a small pack she'd pulled from the rifle case's exterior pocket. She'd had water. She'd watched the range with a quality of attention that Noah found difficult to characterize. She wasn't watching the targets. She wasn't watching the shooters. She was watching the air. Or at least that was the only way he could describe what her eyes were doing. She was tracking something invisible, out there in the heat shimmer, moving across the valley in ways no instrument was recording. When the lunch break started and most personnel moved toward the shade structures at the range's northern edge, Noah walked the other way. She noticed him coming when he was about 20 yards out. Not startled. She simply shifted her focus from the downrange distance to him, with the smooth, unhurried transition of someone accustomed to being approached. He stopped 3 feet away. Sergeant Pierce? He didn't extend his hand. She was still technically an uninvited presence on a restricted range, and any gesture that looked like official welcome wasn't his to make. I know who you are, she said, which wasn't what he'd expected. He absorbed that. Ma'am, not trying to get into whatever's happening with the colonel. That's above my pay grade. It usually is, she said, not unkindly. I'm watching our shooters miss targets they shouldn't miss, he said, keeping his voice low enough that it didn't carry to the shade structures. I've been running the numbers since morning. The data is right. The calls are right. Everything should be working. It isn't, and I think you might know why. He paused. Do you? She studied him for a moment. Then she looked back out at the range, and her expression shifted into something more specific. Not a smile, not really, but a quality of recognition. You've been watching the mirage, she said. The mirage is wrong, he said. For a consistent 6-mile cross, it should be running almost parallel to the ground. It's not. It's stacking, she said. You can see the layers if you know what you're looking for. The valley cuts between those 2 ridges at about a 22-degree offset from the prevailing regional wind. At this time of year, you get a thermal gradient off the southern face that runs roughly perpendicular to the surface wind. And there's a third element, a mechanical turbulence created by the gap in the northern ridgeline, about 40 degrees right of your firing position, that's generating intermittent pressure differentials at approximately 11 to 1,300 meters downrange. She spoke without drama, the way someone would describe a route they'd driven many times. You have 3 separate wind environments operating simultaneously between the firing line and your target. Your shooters are solving for one. The other 2 are doing whatever they want with the bullet. Noah was quiet for 3 seconds, which was how long it took him to cross-reference what she'd just described against everything he'd observed that morning. It fit. Every anomalous miss, every unexplained drift. It fit. 3 layers, he said. 3 layers. How do you read it, practically, when you're behind the gun? She started to answer, and that's when the sound came. It started as a low thud in the distance. Not a gunshot, something more resonant, rhythmic. It built quickly into the unmistakable pressure wave of a large helicopter at low altitude, coming in fast. Everyone in the shade structures looked up. The range cadre looked at each other. A UH-60, flying without the standard approach circuit, came in over the northern ridgeline, and descended with the deliberate directness of a pilot who knew exactly where he was going and was not interested in the traffic pattern. It touched down in the emergency landing zone on the west side of the range, not the designated VIP pad, the emergency zone, which meant whoever was in it had decided the normal formalities were optional. The rotors were still spinning down when the door opened. A man in desert utilities stepped out, 3 stars on his collar. His aide followed 2 steps behind, carrying nothing except a folder and the expression of someone accustomed to moving quickly. The general didn't stop to orient himself. He scanned the range with the quick efficiency of someone who'd visited before, located what he was looking for, and walked directly toward it. He walked past Colonel Hale. Hale had positioned himself to intercept, squared his shoulders, prepared his greeting, the professional posture of a range commander receiving an unannounced general officer visit. The general acknowledged him with a single glance and a small nod that meant later. He kept walking. He stopped in front of the concrete block, in front of Evelyn Cross. Lieutenant General Adrian Mercer was 60 years old and looked like someone had carved him out of compressed experience. He had the particular stillness of a man who'd operated in enough genuine emergencies that ordinary stress no longer registered on his face. He looked at Evelyn. Then he came to a precise, formal attention. He rendered a salute. The range went absolutely quiet. Not the quiet of confusion, the quiet of 41 highly trained operators simultaneously realizing they were looking at something that completely rearranged their understanding of what was happening. Evelyn stood from the concrete block. She returned the salute, unhurried, completely steady. Like this was a perfectly ordinary thing to do in the middle of the Nevada desert, in front of a qualification range that had just spent the morning humiliating some of the best shooters in the American military. Hale stood 8 feet away, not moving. The sealed tan envelope sat on the concrete block where Evelyn had left it, unopened. Mercer lowered his salute. He looked at the envelope on the concrete block, then at Hale, with an expression that didn't require words to interpret. Hale's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, reached down, and picked up the envelope. He opened it. The range stayed quiet. 41 operators who had collectively logged thousands of hours in environments where showing too much reaction was considered a professional liability, were all, at this particular moment, showing too much reaction. Men who had kept their composure under direct fire were watching a colonel read a piece of paper with the focused attention of people watching a fuse burn. Hale read it once. Then he read it again. His face didn't collapse. He was too disciplined for that. But something in the set of his shoulders changed, the way a structure changes when you remove a load-bearing element. He folded the orders. He looked at Evelyn Cross. She was looking at the ridgeline. "Chief Warrant Officer," Hale said. "Sir?" He had more to say. It was visible. The effort of assembling something appropriate, something that would function as an explanation without functioning as an admission. It didn't come together. "I should have read those orders." "Yes, sir," she said. "You should have." Nothing else. No extension of grace, no cushioning. Just the plain fact of it, delivered without heat, which somehow made it heavier than anger would have. Mercer looked at Noah. "Which one is Pierce?" Noah stepped forward. "Sir?" "Good." Mercer looked at the range, at the steel targets visible in the distance, at the heat shimmer rising off the hardpan in the still afternoon air. "We have a situation. We'll brief after the demonstration." He looked at Evelyn. "If you're ready." "Give me 10 minutes," she said. She unpacked the rifle herself. Nobody offered to help. Not because they didn't want to. Several of the operators looked like they genuinely did, but because the deliberateness of the way she did it made assistance seem like an intrusion. Every piece came out with the economy of a process, repeated so many times it had become unconscious. The rifle was a heavily modified bolt-action precision system built around a chassis that Noah didn't recognize from any current inventory. It had the look of something that had been worked on continuously over a long period, not by an armorer following a spec sheet, but by someone who actually knew what they needed and had progressively moved toward it. The stock showed fine scratches from brush contact. The suppressor mount bore oxidation discoloration from extended field use. The scope, a large objective first focal plane unit, had a small chip in the turret housing, repaired with what looked like 2-part epoxy. This was not a display rifle. This was a working tool. She settled into the prone position at the end of the firing line with the naturalness of someone returning to a posture their body remembered completely. She made no scope adjustments. She opened no data book, consulted no range card, entered nothing into a ballistics calculator. She spent 90 seconds studying the valley, the heat shimmer, the dust devils forming and collapsing at the far end of the range, the hawks riding thermals above the southern ridgeline. Then she was still. Nobody spoke. The first shot broke with a muted crack, the suppressor reducing the signature without eliminating it. And 1.4 seconds later, the steel plate at 2,140 meters rang with the clear, percussive report of a direct center hit. Nobody celebrated. They were all doing math. 2,140 meters. No external data. No corrections called. First round. The second shot followed 11 seconds after the first. 2,000 meters, different plate, offset 20 degrees left. Same result. Steel rang. The third shot came 17 seconds after the second. 2,200 meters, past the range's standard qualification distance. A target so far into the desert that Noah had to squint to confirm the impact indicator. It moved. Clean strike. 3 shots, 3 hits, no misses, no adjustments. The entire string completed inside 30 seconds. Evelyn rose from the prone with the same economy she'd used to go down. She cleared the action, indexed the safety, and stepped back from the position. She didn't look at Hale. She wasn't making a point at his expense. She was simply finished. The range was so quiet Noah could hear the hawks. Master Sergeant Rourke, who had been standing 12 feet to Hale's left and had the kind of face that generally communicated very little, had both hands on top of his head. General Mercer said, "Range is clear. Everybody in the briefing structure. Now, Sab." The briefing structure at Iron Mesa was a reinforced prefab building at the range's northwest corner, air-conditioned to a temperature that felt aggressive after the desert heat outside. It held 40 seats in a flat arrangement, a projection screen, and a small raised platform. No windows. Mercer didn't use the platform. He stood in front of it, which Noah had noticed general officers tended to do when they wanted the room to understand this was a conversation and not a presentation. "You've spent this morning wondering why you can't hit targets you should hit," Mercer said. Chief Warrant Officer Cross identified the environmental factors within the first hour of observation. The layered wind gradients in this valley are well documented in range development records going back to Iron Mesa's construction. Those records exist. They're filed. Nobody pulled them before this qualification was designed. He let that sit for a moment. That's relevant context for what I'm about to tell you. He looked around the room. What you ran this morning was not a standard qualification course. It was a selection event. The targets, the environment, the conditions, they were designed to be unsolvable by conventional methodology. The purpose was not to measure your ability to shoot. It was to measure what you do when the conventional methodology stops working, whether you adapt, whether you look for information in places you haven't been taught to look, whether you're humble enough to ask when you don't know. The room processed this in various ways. A few operators had the look of people who had just understood something retroactively. A few looked like the information was landing harder than that. Chief Warrant Officer Cross, Mercer continued, has been observing this range since 0900 this morning. She has a complete assessment of every shooter who ran today's course. Her recommendation, not my recommendation, her recommendation, constitutes the selection criteria for a mission that is currently active, time-sensitive, and not optional. He looked at Evelyn, who was standing along the wall to his left. She said, "I'm going to talk about Phantom Raven." Flat statement. No setup. Several operators in the room went still in a way that suggested the name meant something to them. Noah filed that reaction. It was information. "That's the call sign," she said. "It's also what you're going to hear me called for the duration of this briefing, because the associated personnel file is classified at a level that makes formal introduction impractical." She let that sentence do its work. "What I can tell you is that the techniques in your current long-range precision training manual, the corrections methodology, the environmental reading framework, the multivariable wind solutions, that material came from somewhere. It came from field records, specifically from operational records generated during 17 classified deployments across 4 different theaters over a 14-year period. I know where that material came from because I wrote the field notes it was adapted from." The room was very quiet. Hale was seated at the far left of the front row. His posture was exactly what it always was: straight, controlled, command ready. But Noah, who had spent the morning watching a man who was very certain of himself, was now watching a man recalibrating everything he thought he'd been certain of. "I'm not telling you this so you'll be impressed," Evelyn said. "I'm telling you because you need to understand the baseline I'm working from when I make an assessment, and why that assessment is going to determine who goes on this mission and who doesn't." She glanced at Mercer, who gave a small nod. "There is an American intelligence officer currently stranded at a position in the Kerez mountain range. Her exfil team made contact with a 4-position enemy overwatch network 6 days ago. 2 team members did not make it out. She is mobile but wounded. Her current position has a window, approximately 31 hours from right now, before seasonal weather closes the extraction corridor. After that, the corridor closes for a minimum of 9 days. She will not survive 9 days." The room was still quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. The kind that settles in when a problem becomes concrete. "The rescue element needs to move tonight," Evelyn said. "It needs to be small, 4, maximum 6 personnel, because the terrain doesn't support a larger footprint without detection. The enemy overwatch positions are staffed by experienced shooters operating in terrain. They know it ranges between 1,800 and 2,400 meters. Standard direct action is not viable. This is a precision problem. It requires people who can function at extreme range in extreme conditions under the kind of pressure that makes most people's hands shake." She looked across the room. "I spent this morning figuring out who that is." Nobody asked who she'd chosen. They were all doing the same calculation, running the morning back through the filter of what they now understood it had actually been, matching their own performance against the standard she'd just described. "Staff Sergeant Pierce," she said. "You're on the element." Noah felt the weight of 40 sets of eyes. "Gunnery Sergeant Laura Voss," she continued. Voss, compact, sharp-featured, from the Marine contingent, gave a single nod from the middle of the room. "Sergeant First Class Danny Rael." Rael, Army Special Forces, sat in the second row and absorbed the selection with the stillness of someone who had been waiting for it. Warrant Officer James Chu. Chu was the youngest operator in the room, SEAL qualified, and he received the news with a controlled exhale that was the only visible sign of what it cost him to keep his expression neutral. 4 people. "We brief at 1,800, Evelyn said. "Full operational package. Terrain, enemy disposition, ROE, communications, extraction timing, contingencies." She paused. "I'll be leading the element." The room's silence shifted again, briefly, as that last sentence landed. Mercer said, "Questions." A voice from the back. Sergeant Major Torres, one of the senior NCOs not selected. "Ma'am, the 4-position overwatch network. What's the spacing?" "Variable," Evelyn said. "The terrain distributes them across approximately a 1,200-meter arc. They don't operate with mutual visibility. The mountain geometry prevents it. They communicate by radio and use a check-in protocol." She paused. "Which is useful, because when a position stops checking in, the other 3 respond to that. We'll be using that." Torres nodded slowly. "And the exfil corridor? Helicopter or foot?" "Both. We go in on foot. The extraction helo meets us at a secondary LZ after the corridor opens. The window for the helo is narrow. We have approximately a 40-minute pickup window before the weather makes the approach unsafe." She looked at Torres. "If we're not at that LZ in 40 minutes, the helo goes. We walk out." "And the walking out distance?" 61 kilometers to the nearest viable road." Torres absorbed this without expression. "Understood." Hale spoke for the first time since the briefing had started. His voice was even, the voice of a man who had decided that his only remaining option was absolute professionalism. "What do you need from this installation?" Evelyn looked at him. "A resupply of M188LR, 2 cases. Cold weather gear for 4 personnel, mountain spec. A SATCOM unit with current encryption, and a vehicle to the airfield by 1700. "You'll have it," Hale said. "Thank you, Colonel." He held her gaze for a beat. Something passed between them that Noah couldn't fully read. It wasn't hostility anymore, and it wasn't resolved either. It was the particular discomfort of a man who understood exactly what he'd done that morning and was living inside that understanding. "Dismissed," Mercer said. "Pierce, Voss, Rael, Chu, you stay." The room emptied. When it was just the 6 of them, Mercer, Evelyn, and the 4 selected operators, the general sat down on the edge of the platform and looked at the floor for a moment. "I'm going to tell you something that doesn't go in any report," he said. "The officer we're going in for, her name is Captain Diane Reeves. She was running a collection operation that has been active for 11 months. What she's carrying, what's in her kit, is not replaceable. What she knows is not replaceable." He looked up. "I've been in this business for 37 years. I've ordered men and women into situations I knew were likely fatal. I've done it because the math required it." He paused. "This is not one of those situations. I believe you can bring her home. Chief Warrant Officer Cross has run worse terrain in worse conditions and come out with everyone she went in with." He looked at Evelyn. "Every time." Evelyn didn't respond to that. She was looking at the projection screen, which was still blank. "Get some rest," Mercer said. 1800, we go through the full package. Tonight, you move." The 4 operators stood to leave. Noah was almost at the door when Evelyn said, behind him, not loudly, "Pierce!" He turned. "The 3 wind layers," she said, "in the valley this morning. You saw the mirage was wrong before anyone else did. You just didn't know what to do with what you saw." "No, ma'am." "Tonight you will." She looked at him steadily. The desert afternoon light was coming through the door he'd half opened, cutting across the floor. "That's why you're on this team and not someone who scored higher on the qual." He stood in the doorway. "And if I'd stayed quiet? Kept the observation to myself?" "You wouldn't have," she said. "That's not who you are. I watched you for 4 hours this morning. You'd have asked eventually. You were going to keep asking until you understood." "How do you know that?" She picked up her rifle case from where she'd set it against the wall. "Because when I walked onto this range, every operator on the line looked at me the same way. Like I was an interruption. You were the only one who looked at me like I was a question." She walked past him through the door into the hard Nevada light. Behind him, in the empty briefing room, the sealed envelope sat on the chair where Hale had left it after he'd read it. Opened. Too late. But open. The airfield at Iron Mesa was a single strip of cracked asphalt running east-west between 2 low ridges, lit at night by a string of blue taxiway lights that made the desert look like the bottom of an ocean. The C-130 that would carry them to the forward staging area was already on the ramp when the 4 operators arrived at 1740, gear loaded, faces carrying the particular blankness of people who had spent the last 90 minutes converting anxiety into process. Noah threw his bag into the cargo net and sat down on the red nylon seating along the fuselage. Across from him, Gunnery Sergeant Laura Voss was running a function check on her rifle with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done it so many times the movements had stopped requiring conscious thought. She didn't look up. Sergeant First Class Danny Rael was studying a laminated terrain card, tilting it toward the overhead light, tracing elevation lines with one finger. Warrant Officer James Chu sat with his eyes closed and his hands loose on his knees, which either meant he was sleeping or doing something in his head that looked like sleeping from the outside. Evelyn Cross sat at the forward end of the cargo bay, separate from the group by about 8 feet. She had her data book open on her knee, a physical notebook, not a tablet, and she was writing in it with a mechanical pencil, small, precise notations that Noah couldn't read from where he sat. Her rifle case was secured in the cargo net above her. She hadn't spoken since the briefing ended. The 1800 brief had run 2 hours and 20 minutes. Mercer had walked them through the full package. Satellite imagery of the Carez range, topographic analysis, the enemy Overwatch network's known positions and estimated fields of fire, Captain Reeves's last confirmed location, and the signals protocol she was using to communicate her status. The imagery was 3 days old, which Evelyn had noted twice, both times without elaboration, in a tone that made clear she considered 3-day-old imagery in active mountain terrain to be approximately as useful as a weather forecast from last week. The enemy positions were the central problem. 4 of them, distributed across a ridgeline system that overlooked the only viable approach to Reeves's position. They operated independently, no mutual line of sight between positions, but coordinated through a radio check-in protocol running on a 90-minute cycle. The protocol used simple authentication, a rotating numeric code transmitted at each check-in. If a position missed its window, the other 3 positions went to alert status within 6 minutes. 6 minutes, Rael had said during the brief, not as a question. 6 minutes. Evelyn had confirmed. That's our window between first engagement and losing the element of surprise. That's our window, she'd agreed, which is why we're not engaging position by position. We're engaging all four simultaneously, or as close to simultaneously as the geometry allows, which meant 4 shooters, 1 target each, at ranges between 1,800 and 2,400 meters. In mountain terrain at night, in temperatures that would drop below freezing before midnight, with a wind environment that Evelyn had described as significantly more complex than what you ran this morning. Nobody had said anything to that. The math was simple enough. This morning's conditions had beaten the best shooters in the American military. Tonight's would be worse. The C-130's ramp came up, the engines built to a steady roar. Noah felt the aircraft begin to roll, and he looked across the cargo bay at the 4 people he was going into the mountains with. He'd known Voss by reputation. Marine long-range shooter, 2 combat deployments, a classified commendation that nobody discussed openly. They'd never worked together. Rael he knew slightly better. They'd overlapped briefly at a joint training event 18 months ago, and Rael had struck him then as someone whose confidence was the functional kind, built on actual experience rather than performed certainty. Chu he didn't know at all, except that the kid had been the youngest shooter on the range that morning and had hit 17 of 20 targets on the standard qualification strings before the conditions went sideways. What he didn't know was whether any of them could shoot at 2,400 meters in the dark, in the cold, with the clock running. What he didn't know was whether he could. They landed at a forward operating location that had no official designation on any map Noah had been cleared to read. It was a collection of prefab structures and hardened revetments in a valley that felt like it had been cut out of the mountain by something that didn't care much about geometry. The altitude was noticeably higher. Noah's lungs registered it immediately, a slight tightness that would ease in an hour or so and then return as fatigue if he didn't manage his exertion carefully. Evelyn moved them through the staging process with efficiency that suggested she'd run similar infills enough times to have a preferred sequence. Gear checks, comms tests, each operator on the element running a radio check on the SATCOM net that would connect them to the overhead asset, providing eyes on the target area. Cold weather layers under the load-bearing equipment. Ammunition distribution. The M118LR they'd resupplied at Iron Mesa distributed in pre-counted lots, each operator knowing their exact round count before they moved. It was during the ammunition distribution that Chu said, to no one in particular, "What's the cold zero adjustment going to look like up there?" Evelyn answered without looking up from the gear she was packing. "I'll give you a baseline when we reach the first position. Temperature, altitude, and the specific round lot will all factor in. Don't try to calculate it in advance." "I have it dialed for this altitude." "You have it dialed for this altitude at Iron Mesa's temperature and atmospheric pressure," she said. "The conditions up there are different enough that your current data will get you close and then cost you the shot. Wait for the update." Chu absorbed this. Copy. He went back to his gear, but something in the set of his jaw suggested the response hadn't fully landed as instruction. Noah noticed it and filed it. Chu was 26, sharp, and had the particular quality of confidence that talented young operators sometimes had. Not arrogance exactly, but an incomplete understanding of how much they didn't know yet. It wasn't a character flaw. It was a developmental stage. The question was whether tonight was going to be where that stage ended. Voss had noticed it too. She caught Noah's eye briefly. A fractional look, the kind of communication between experienced operators that required no words. They moved out at 2140. The mountain terrain in the Carez Range was nothing like the Nevada desert, except in the fundamental quality of its indifference to human preference. The valley floor gave way to broken rocky slope within the first kilometer, and the slope gave way to a series of ridgeline scrambles that required hands as much as feet in several sections. The night was clear, which was operationally useful and physically brutal. No cloud cover meant no insulation, and by the time they'd been moving for 90 minutes, the temperature had dropped far enough that Noah's exhaled breath fogged visibly despite the effort of the climb. They moved in a standard patrol file, 5 meters between each person, Evelyn on point. She navigated without a headlamp, using the ambient starlight and a night vision monocular she'd pull up occasionally to check specific terrain features. She moved at a pace that was sustainable, not slow, not aggressive, the precise middle ground that covered ground without degrading the shooter's fine motor function when they needed it later. Noah recognized the calibration. It was the pace of someone who had thought carefully about what state she needed her team to arrive in. He had been watching her since the range that morning. Not in any way he would have found difficult to explain. There was nothing personal in it, nothing beyond the watchfulness of a professional trying to understand the person he was staking his life on. What he'd observed across 10 hours of proximity was a pattern that didn't fit any single category. She wasn't a commanding presence in the way Hale was, didn't fill a room by existing in it, didn't have the kind of gravity that made other people orbit her, but she also wasn't quiet in any passive sense. Her attention was total. When she looked at something, she appeared to actually see it. When she spoke, she'd already decided exactly what she needed to communicate, and there was no excess on either side of it. What she didn't do, he'd noticed, was explain herself. Not the decision to sit on the concrete block rather than leave. Not the demonstration on the range. Not the team selection. Not the mission parameters that most senior NCOs would have walked through twice to make sure everyone was aligned. She operated as though the explanation was the performance. Show you. Not tell you. Trust that you're paying attention. At the 2.4-kilometer mark, she stopped the element at a rocky overhang that provided natural cover from any northern observation and knelt to pull out her map. She clicked on a red lens penlight and held it low and close. "We're here," she said, pointing. "The first observation position is another 800 meters along this ridgeline. We'll stage there and I'll do the final target assessment before we push to individual firing positions." Questions. It wasn't phrased as an invitation, it was an inventory check. She was giving them the opportunity to surface problems before they reached a point where surfacing problems was no longer an option. Rail said, "The check-in window, we're running at what, 4 hours to the next cycle when we reach position?" 3 hours 40 minutes, Evelyn said. "Enough time to get eyes on all 4 positions, confirm locations against the imagery, and get everyone established. Not enough time to second-guess the plan after we're in position." "Understood." Rail folded his terrain card. "One more. The wounded officer, Reeves. What's her current status?" "Last signal check was 6 hours ago. She was mobile, moving slowly due to a lower leg wound. She's been managing it herself." Evelyn kept her voice level. "She's had training for exactly this. She knows what to do. Our job is to open the corridor so the helo can reach her. Her job is to be at the secondary LZ when that happens. And if she's not mobile when we get the corridor open, then we adjust a beat. But she'll be mobile." The certainty in it wasn't false confidence. It was operational necessity. If you started planning for the version where the rescue target wasn't where she was supposed to be, you'd plan yourself into paralysis. You built the plan for the viable scenario, and you adjusted when reality required it. Voss said, from Noah's left, "The 4th position, the one at 2400, that's yours?" Evelyn looked at her steadily. "That's mine." "And if something goes wrong at that position and you can't engage, who's the backup?" "Nothing goes wrong at that position." Voss held her gaze for a moment. "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer that works," Evelyn said. "If I go down before the engagement, the mission profile changes and Rael takes command and calls it. But the 4th position has to be engaged at range because the terrain geometry doesn't allow a closer approach. If it doesn't go down simultaneously with the other 3, the survivor alerts the network and we lose the window." She paused. "So nothing goes wrong at that position." Voss didn't push it, but her expression said she'd registered exactly what that meant. That Evelyn had built the plan around her own indispensability at a critical point, which was either the mark of complete confidence or the mark of someone who'd stopped accounting for their own failure. Noah had been thinking the same thing. They pushed on. The next 800 meters gained significant elevation and crossed 2 sections of loose scree that required careful footwork in the dark. Noah's breathing steadied into the rhythm of the climb. Behind him, Chu was moving quietly, but Noah could hear the younger man's breathing running slightly faster than the effort strictly required, the particular sound of someone managing their adrenaline. Not a problem. The adrenaline would be useful later. The observation position was a natural rock formation that looked like the mountain had arranged it deliberately for the purpose. A low shelf of stone about 40 centimeters high, running roughly east-west, with a clear line of sight across the valley to the ridgeline system that held the 4 enemy positions. From here, in daylight, it would have been an ideal hide. In the dark, it was a collection of shadows that Evelyn identified unerringly, moving to the eastern end and settling into the prone without hesitation. She pulled the night vision monocular up and began scanning. The team arrayed behind her, maintaining low profiles against the rock shelf, nobody moving more than necessary. The scan took 11 minutes. Noah counted. She moved methodically, not sweeping, but dwelling. She'd stop at a point, hold for 30 to 60 seconds, then move fractionally and hold again. She was building something in her head, a spatial picture of the terrain that the satellite imagery couldn't fully provide. The fold of a ridgeline, the actual angle of a rocky outcropping versus what the photo had suggested, the specific thermal signature of a position that had been occupied for hours and had transferred warmth to the rock around it. When she was done, she lowered the monocular and turned to the team. She spoke in a quiet voice that just reached them. 4 positions confirmed. The imagery was reasonably accurate on 3 of them. Position 2 has moved. They're currently about 40 meters south of the mapped location, which puts them at roughly 2,060 meters from where we need Voss. She looked at Voss. Still viable from the alternate position we discussed. You'll need to account for an additional 4-degree right offset. I'll give you the updated data when you're in. Voss nodded once. What about the sight line from the alternate? Clear. There's a break in the ridge line about 2/3 of the way to the target. It's a natural gap. The thermal imagery shows it's used as an air corridor by local wildlife. Your bullet will pass through it if your elevation is right. If it's not, I know, Voss said. Rock face. Yes, Chu spoke. What changed at position 2? Why'd they move? Probably rotated personnel, Evelyn said. New team sets up differently. The experienced position would have stayed where they knew the sight lines. She glanced at him. It's not significant. They're still in the same general sector and they haven't moved to a position that improves their coverage. They got lazy and picked a spot that was probably easier to sleep in. Or they spotted something and repositioned, Chu said. The sentence landed in a brief silence. Possible, Evelyn said. Her voice didn't change. That's why we're going to spend the next hour confirming their pattern before we push to individual firing positions. If they're repositioned due to a threat response, their behavior will show it. She held Chu's gaze. Good instinct. Stay with that. Chu gave a small nod, but something in his expression remained unsettled. He had identified a legitimate risk. She hadn't dismissed it, and that was the right call. But Noah could see that Chu was running the implications forward in his mind and not quite arriving at a comfortable place. If the enemy had spotted something, a patrol, a signal, an anomaly, they might already be operating in a heightened state, which would compress the 6-minute window or eliminate it entirely. Nobody said that out loud. They'd all arrived at it on their own. The hour of observation was the hardest part of the night so far. Not because anything happened, nothing did, which was the point. The enemy positions maintained their pattern. Position 2, despite the relocation, checked in on the radio at the 90-minute mark with the correct authentication code, which Chu's intercept receiver picked up, and Rael confirmed against the sequence from the intelligence package. Normal. Routine. The positions were not in elevated alert posture. Evelyn had been right. They just moved for comfort. At 01 or 2, she distributed the final data to each shooter. Updated range, temperature correction, the specific wind assessment she'd built from an hour of watching the mountain air move in the dark. It wasn't a ballistics table. It was a set of decisions. This target, this range, this wind environment. Here's what you need to do. She delivered it without performance, the way a mechanic tells you what needs fixing. Here's what it is, here's how to address it. Noah received his data for position 3, approximately 1,980 meters, on a rocky saddle that was slightly elevated relative to the main ridgeline. His adjusted wind solution required a correction he'd never used in a live engagement. He wrote it in his data book anyway, then looked at it, then closed the book. He'd know what to do when he was behind the gun. Either that would be true, or it wouldn't. Evelyn spoke quietly to the group. We move to individual positions in 10 minutes. Once everyone is in, I'll run a comm check on the element net. When I say execute, you have a 3-second window to engage. 3 seconds between first and last shot is the maximum. After that, the radio timing creates a detection risk. She looked at each of them in turn. Don't rush the shot. But don't hold it either. Read your environment, make your correction, and trust it. One adjustment. That's all you should need. If you're making more than one correction, You've lost the thread and you need to start over. We don't have time to start over. What if we miss the first round, Rael said. Adjust and fire, she said immediately. One adjustment, then send the follow-up. If that misses, she paused for just a fraction of a second, then you call it on comms and I make the decision about the mission profile. But that won't happen. How do you know? She looked at him steadily. Because I chose you. Rael absorbed this without expression. It wasn't bravado she was handing him. It was something more functional. She was telling him that the selection process had been a calibration she trusted, and that her trust in the calibration was a resource he could draw on when his own confidence ran thin. The pressure of that particular form of confidence was significant. It was also, Noah thought, exactly correct. The worst thing she could have said was that she wasn't sure. The second worst thing was to pretend she was certain when she wasn't. What she'd actually said was, I made a choice and I'm standing behind it. Now stand behind yourself. The four operators separated toward their individual positions, a process that took 20 minutes of careful movement, each person finding their way to the predetermined rock shelf or crevice or natural depression that Evelyn had designated on the terrain map. The positions were separated enough that mutual support wasn't possible. Each shooter was alone with their rifle and their data and whatever was happening in their head. Noah reached his position at 0143. The rock shelf was exactly as described. A flat section of exposed stone roughly the size of a dining table, angled slightly downward toward the valley, with a clear line of sight across the darkness to where position 3 sat invisible against the far ridgeline. He settled into the prone, found his natural point of aim, and adjusted his body until the reticle was drifting steadily across the target sector without muscular effort. Then he waited. The cold was a specific kind, not the wet cold of the Pacific Northwest or the blunt cold of the upper Midwest, but a dry, sharp cold that found edges. The edge of his collar, the gap between his gloves and his cuffs. It pressed into the concrete of his concentration, and he pushed back against it with the only tool he had, which was focus. He looked through the scope. The target sector was dark and still. He could see the rough shape of the ridgeline, the slightly different darkness of the rocky saddle where position 3 was located. No thermal capability on this scope. He was working with ambient light and a reticle and everything Evelyn had told him about where to look and what to look for. He waited. At 0208, a small orange point appeared in the darkness of the saddle. Someone lighting something. The brief, careless flare of a lighter or a match. There for 2 seconds and then gone. An experienced operator would have known better, but experience was unevenly distributed, and whoever was running position 3 tonight had just told Noah exactly where they were sitting. He refined his point of aim, made the adjustments Evelyn had given him, elevation first, then wind hold, then the small correction for the temperature differential she'd predicted. He breathed. He let the reticle settle. His earpiece crackled, barely a sound. Evelyn's voice, so quiet it was almost inside his own skull. Element, comm check, acknowledge in sequence. One by one, each shooter keyed their mic twice, the double click that meant in position, ready. Voss first, Rail second, Chu third, Noah fourth, silence. Then, in the same barely there voice, 3 minutes, read your environment, 1 adjustment, trust it. Noah breathed out, looked at the saddle. He looked at the darkness between him and it, reading the air the way Evelyn had begun to teach him that morning in the Nevada desert. Not the instruments, not the data alone, but the actual air, the way it moved, the way it bent and stacked and did the things that nobody's equipment had found a way to fully measure. He saw it. Just barely. A slight variation in the mirage pattern at mid-range, a thermal layer rising off a rocky outcropping at approximately 800 meters, creating a slight upward deflection in the air column above it. Negligible at shorter ranges. At 1980 meters, it would push his bullet fractionally high unless he accounted for it. He made one more adjustment to his elevation. A small one. 1/4 mil. He settled back into the reticle. His heartbeat was slow. Not because he wasn't afraid, he was, in the particular functional way that fear operated when it had been trained into something useful. His palms were not sweating. His trigger finger was resting on the guard, not the trigger. He was doing the thing Evelyn had described as reading, which was not thinking and not calculating, but something in the space between the two, where all the calculation has already been done, and what remains is simply seeing the truth of the situation and acting on it. Execute, Evelyn said. He moved his finger to the trigger. He exhaled halfway and stopped. He pressed. The rifle moved against his shoulder. The suppressor reduced the crack to something sharp and contained. He was already cycling the bolt, reacquiring the target sector through the scope, looking for the indicator, the thermal disruption, the physical response that would tell him what had happened. Two of the other three shots reached his ears almost simultaneously, Voss and Rael, within a half-second of each other. Then Chew, a beat later than the window. Noah found the saddle in his scope. The orange point that had been there, the careless flame, was gone. The thermal signature of the position was already beginning to change in a way that told him what he needed to know. Then Chew's voice came on the net, tight and controlled, but carrying something underneath it that Noah recognized. Position 4. Missed. I'm adjusting. One position. One of the four was still active. In the silence that followed, Noah heard Evelyn's breathing in his earpiece. Steady, unchanged, and then her voice, quiet and absolute. Chew. Talk to me. Chew. Talk to me. The net stayed quiet for 2 seconds. In a situation where 6 minutes separated functional surprise from total compromise, 2 seconds was not nothing. Wind shifted at the last second. Chew's voice was controlled but had the particular texture of a man whose hands were doing things faster than his mouth could organize words. I pulled left. Round went wide. I don't know how wide. I'm cycling. Distance to position 4, Evelyn said. 2,200, maybe 2,250. It's the far end of the arc. What's your current hold? A pause. 1.4 mils left, 0.2 elevation up, temperature correction applied. Drop the left hold to 1.2, she said immediately. The thermal layer above the northern saddle is pulling your bullet left at that range. I saw it when I was scanning. You overcorrected. He stopped. Copy. Adjusting. Noah was still watching his own sector, but his attention was split, the trained part of his brain keeping the scope on the downrange darkness, while the rest of him was tracking the radio traffic and running the arithmetic that nobody wanted to say aloud. 6 minutes from first shot to alert. 2 shots had already been fired at position 4. Every second Chew spent in the adjustment cycle was a second they couldn't recover. Rael, Evelyn said. Status. Position 2 down, confirmed. Voss? Position 1 down, confirmed. Pierce. Position 3 down, confirmed. 3 of 4. The corridor to Reeves was not open. It would not be open until position 4 stopped being a problem, and position 4 was currently a man with a radio who had almost certainly heard 2 supersonic rounds pass close enough to understand that something was happening on the ridgeline. Chew, Evelyn said. How long? 15 seconds. You have 10. The net went silent. Noah counted. 1, 2, 3. He kept his scope on his sector. The doctrinal requirement, the thing that training burned into you. Hold your sector, trust your element, don't chase the crisis that isn't yours. 4. 5. He could feel the mountain air moving against his face, that slight shift that Evelyn had mentioned, the thermal layer over the northern saddle doing exactly what she'd said it would do. 6. 7. Chew fired. The crack of it reached Noah a half-second later, carried on the cold air from somewhere to his northeast. Then silence. The silence that meant either resolution or the beginning of something much worse. Chew. Evelyn's voice. Report. Another 2 seconds. Miss. Flat. No effect. Just the word. The word sat in the earpiece like something with physical weight. Position 4 is moving, Chew said. He's off the saddle. I can see thermal. He's going prone behind cover. He knows. Noah closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them. Element. Maintain positions, Evelyn said. Her voice had not changed. Not in pace, not in volume, not in any quality that suggested the situation had altered her fundamental state. Chew, what cover? Large rock formation, north edge of the saddle. Wait. A pause. He's reaching for something. Radio. He's reaching for the radio. The math resolved itself in Noah's mind with the clean finality of a ballistic solution. They were out of time. The 6-minute window had assumed simultaneous engagement of all 4 positions. It had not accounted for a surviving shooter with a radio who was now actively trying to use it. The moment that transmission went through, the mission profile changed from precision rescue operation to contested extraction under alert conditions, which was a different mission entirely and one for which they did not have the assets. Evelyn spoke. Chew, range to target right now. 2200, and he's moved. He's behind the rock. I've lost the direct line. I have a partial. Left side of the formation, maybe 30% exposure. Partial shot at 2200. Yes. What's your confidence? A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. 60%. That's not enough, Voss said on the net. She wasn't wrong. 60% confidence on a partial shot at 2200 meters, with a target actively seeking radio contact, was a coin flip with consequences. I know it's not enough, Chu said, and his voice carried something raw in it now. The specific sound of a young operator understanding in real time that his miss was the thing that had created this problem, and that the window for correcting it was closing. Give me another angle. If I can move 30 meters north along the ridgeline, I might get a better line on. You'll be exposed, Rael said. That saddle has a partial sight line north. If he's alert, I know. Chew. Evelyn again. Quiet. Absolute. Stay in position. Ma'am, I can get the angle. Stay in position. No heat in it. Just the thing itself. A directive issued by someone who had already run the scenario forward and arrived at the conclusion before Chu had finished proposing the alternative. Moving on that ridgeline right now, in the dark, at the pace you'd need to move, you'll make noise, you'll silhouette against the north face when you crest the feature. And if that shooter is even partially trained, he will hear you or see you before you get the angle. Then we have two problems instead of one. Silence on the net. Then what? Chu said. The rawness was still there, and now something else alongside it. Not quite desperation, but the edge of it. Evelyn said, I'm moving. Noah heard it in his earpiece and simultaneously processed the implication. His head came up fractionally from his scope. Across the dark ridgeline to his left, somewhere in the rocks, Evelyn Cross was already in motion. Ma'am, Rael started, maintain positions, hold sectors, do not move. Her voice was low and completely even. The voice of someone running across broken mountain terrain in the dark without apparently experiencing the exertion. I need eyes on the formation from the south approach. Pierce, does your current position give you any angle on the northern saddle? Noah looked. He adjusted his scope and swept right, moving off his assigned sector in direct response to her question, which was the only legitimate reason to do so. The northern saddle was partially visible from his position, but only partially. The rock formation Chu had described. He could see its general shape in the ambient light, a darker mass against the ridgeline. He could not see behind it. Partial, he said, I've got the right side of the formation, not the northern exposure. If he breaks cover to the right, you'll have him. Yes. Then watch the right side. Watching. He moved his reticle to the right edge of the rock formation and held it there. 1,920 meters, slightly different angle than his original target. He made the mental adjustment, not a full solution. He didn't have time for a full solution, but a working approximation that would be close enough if the shot was there. He pressed his cheek firmly against the stock and breathed. On the net, he could hear Evelyn moving. Not her footsteps. She was too disciplined for that, but the slight change in her breathing that the radio's sensitivity was picking up. A rhythmic control that suggested significant physical effort being managed precisely. Time, she said. It wasn't a question, it was a request for data. Rael, who had the team's timer running, 4 minutes 12 seconds since first shot, less than 2 minutes to the 6-minute mark, after which, if no check-in arrived from any of the 4 positions, the enemy network, wherever its nearest command element was, would generate a response. That response might take 20 minutes to arrive in force, or it might take 2 hours. They didn't know. What they knew was that they did not want to be in this mountain range when it arrived. He hasn't transmitted yet, Chu said. I can still see thermal. He's behind the rock. He might be waiting to confirm. He's smart, Evelyn said. He heard 2 rounds but didn't get hit. He's not sure if it's an attack or a misfire from one of the other positions. He's waiting for the check-in cycle to see if anyone responds before he commits. That buys us something, Voss said. 90 seconds, Evelyn said. Maybe less if he decides to stop waiting. Noah kept his reticle on the right edge of the rock formation. The mountain was quiet in the way that mountains were quiet at this altitude at this hour. A complete structural silence that made the sound of his own heartbeat seem intrusive. He was aware of his pulse in a way he usually wasn't, aware of the slight movement it caused at the end of the rifle barrel, the small oscillation that experienced shooters learn to account for and that could still, at extreme range, be the difference between a hit and a miss. He thought about Evelyn's words from that morning, standing outside the briefing room with Nevada light cutting across the gravel. Read. Adjust once. Trust the truth. He thought about Chu's miss, the wind shift at the last second, the overcorrection, the way a single variable, poorly read, had cascaded into the situation they were currently living inside. He thought about the sealed envelope on the concrete block, opened too late. He kept his reticle exactly where it was. Evelyn reached the southern approach to the saddle at 4 minutes 40 seconds. She knew the time without looking at anything. She'd been counting since she started moving, the way she'd trained herself to count through 2 decades of situations where looking at a watch was not an available option. The southern approach gave her a line of sight that cut behind the rock formation at approximately a 15-degree angle. Not a clean shot, not with the target pressed against the north face of the rock, but better than what anyone else had. She went to ground behind a low shelf of stone and brought her rifle up. Through the scope, the rock formation resolved into specifics. A natural granite mass roughly 4 meters tall and 6 wide, one face steeply angled, providing solid cover from the north and northeast. The thermal signature behind it was visible, just barely, as a faint warmth leaking around the eastern edge. A man. Alive. Pressed close against the stone. She studied the geometry. He was tight against the rock's north face. To her south approach angle, she had approximately 8% exposure. Not a target, not viable. He would need to move. And he would move because staying compressed against a rock face in freezing temperatures while waiting for a radio check-in that wasn't coming was not a sustainable position. He would either transmit or he would shift to assess. Either action would give her something. She slowed her breathing to the pace that her body had learned over years was the pace at which her hands stopped being affected by her heartbeat. Not slow in any dramatic sense, just the specific rhythm that meant she was operating at the level below conscious thought where the training lived. 4:55, Rael said quietly on the net. 5 seconds. On the rock face, the thermal signature moved. Not much. A shift, a repositioning. The man behind the rock was making a decision. He's moving, she said. I see it, Chu said. He's going for the radio. I can see his arm. The thermal signature moved again, this time more definitively. His right shoulder came around the eastern edge of the rock. Not much, 15 centimeters of exposure. The movement of a man bringing a radio to his mouth while keeping his body covered. 15 centimeters. At her current range, she was inside 800 meters, having moved fast down the southern approach. 15 centimeters of exposure on a man pressing against granite was an extraordinarily difficult shot. Not for the ballistics, which at 800 meters were manageable. For the margin. There was no margin. If she pulled 1/4 millimeter in any direction, the round hit rock. If she waited for more exposure, he would transmit. She had exactly the shot that was available. No better one was coming. She made one adjustment, a fraction of elevation, accounting for the slight uphill angle of the shot, and she pressed the trigger in the space between heartbeats, in the small window that her body had learned to find and use. The rifle moved. The shoulder behind the rock did not move anymore. The net was absolutely silent. Then Rael's voice. 5 minutes, 8 seconds. Then Chu, very quietly. He didn't transmit. Evelyn stayed in the prone for 3 seconds, scope still on the rock formation, watching the thermal signature change in the way thermal signatures changed when they stopped being a person and started being the absence of one. Then she pushed up to a knee and keyed her mic. Element, corridor is open. We move in 4 minutes. Final gear check. Consolidate on my position. Rail, take point on the descent. You have the route to the secondary approach. Chu. Ma'am. Good adjustment on the second shot. A pause. The first miss happened. We don't carry it. Move. What she didn't say, and what Noah heard anyway, in the specific quality of her silence before the next transmission, was everything that the mission had almost cost. Not an accusation, not forgiveness either, just the acknowledgement that the line between those two things had been closer than any of them would have preferred, and that the acknowledgement was sufficient and the mission was still running, and the carrying of what had happened would have to wait for a time and place that was not a mountain in the dark with a wounded intelligence officer waiting for a corridor that had just, at significant cost, been opened. Noah was up and moving inside 20 seconds. The descent to the secondary approach took 40 minutes. Rael led with the quiet precision of someone who had done mountain movement in darkness, enough times to have developed an intuitive sense for the terrain's logic, where the rock would hold weight, where the loose surface would shift, where the slope's angle made a particular line of travel faster than the obvious alternative. The team moved in a tight file, faster than they'd moved on the ascent because the mission's phase had changed. The precision phase was done. They were now in the extraction phase, which had a different set of demands. Noah ran the post-engagement inventory in his head as he moved, which was something he did automatically in the transition between phases, a habit from his early deployments that he'd never been able to fully turn off. Position 3, confirmed down. His shot, his data, Evelyn's wind assessment from the observation position, the elevation adjustment he'd made on his own at the last moment, the quarter-mil correction for the thermal layer he'd seen in the mirage, had been the right call. He knew it had been the right call because the target had gone down on the first round. He also knew that he hadn't been certain it was the right call when he made it. He'd trusted the read. That was a different thing from certainty, and the distinction mattered to him in a way he didn't entirely have language for yet. Chu was running immediately behind him. The younger man's movement was efficient. He was in good shape, good mountain technique. But Noah could feel the particular quality of energy coming off him that was not pace or effort, but the residue of what had happened on that ridgeline. The weight of the miss, the weight of the near transmission, the weight of having been the variable that turned a clean operation into a 6-minute crisis that a woman in her 40s had resolved by crossing 500 meters of broken mountain terrain in the dark and making a shot through a 15-centimeter window at 800 meters. Nobody had commented on that shot. There was nothing to say about it that the shot didn't already say for itself. At the bottom of the descent, Evelyn called a 30-second halt at a natural rock windbreak that cut the temperature by several degrees and provided good all-around cover. She did a physical check of each operator. Not a full medical assessment, but the quick hands contact of a leader confirming that everyone was functional. She reached Noah last, looked at his face briefly, and said nothing. He was fine. She could see that he was fine. She moved to the front. Reeves's last position was approximately 900 meters northeast of here. We're going to approach from the south. It keeps us below the ridgeline and minimizes our silhouette. When we get within 200 meters, I'll go forward alone to make initial contact. The rest of you hold the perimeter. She looked at Chu. You're covering the northern approach. That's where any response element will come from if the network had contact with anyone we didn't account for. Chu said, "Copy." His voice was level. Whatever he was carrying, he'd compressed it into something he could function with. Radio contact with the helo in, she glanced at Rael, 22 minutes to their inbound window. 22 minutes, she said. We need to be at the LZ with Reeves in 18. Move. The 900 meters to Reeves's position was the most uncomfortable movement of the night, not because of the terrain, which was difficult but manageable, but because of the unknowns it contained. The 4 Overwatch positions were down. But Evelyn had been clear, in the briefing and again on the mountain, that the imagery was 3 days old and that enemy dispositions in active mountain terrain could change. There could be a 5th element. There could be a patrol route they hadn't mapped. There could be a command element that had already picked up on the absence of check-ins and was moving toward the area. There could be nothing. Probably there was nothing. Probably was a word Noah had spent his career learning to remain uncomfortable with. Evelyn stopped the element at a cluster of boulders that provided good concealment and reasonable lines of fire in 3 directions. She handed her rifle to Voss without ceremony, a gesture that communicated both the tactical logic of moving forward, unencumbered, and a level of trust that was not nothing, and moved northeast into the dark. She had a sidearm and a small medical kit. That was all. The wait was 8 minutes. Noah spent them watching his sector, a rocky slope falling away to the south, nothing moving on it, and listening to the mountain, Wind through gaps in the rock, the distant sound of something that might have been an animal moving on the far ridgeline, the rhythmic sound of his own breathing. Then Evelyn's voice on the net, quiet and controlled. I have her. She's mobile, barely. Left leg wound is manageable. She's been taking care of it. We're moving to the LZ 9 minutes. Copy, Rael said. We're moving to cover the approach. To stay north until we're at the LZ perimeter, then collapse in. Copy. Noah heard the relief in the team's breathing before anyone said anything. It wasn't dramatic. No one exhaled loudly or said anything that could be described as emotional. But the particular quality of focused tension that had been present since the missed shot changed, fractionally, in the way that tension changes when the worst-case scenario has been removed from the table. Reeves was alive. She was mobile. The corridor was open. The helo was inbound. The mission was not complete. But the shape of it had changed. Captain Diane Reeves was 34 years old and looked, in the ambient light, like someone who had been living on the wrong side of a mountain for 6 days and was not going to pretend otherwise. She was moving under her own power, but the movement had the quality of someone who had made a decision to keep going on will rather than comfort. Her left leg was wrapped in a field dressing that was doing its job but showed the staining of a wound that had been messier than she'd been able to fully address. She had a pack that she refused to let anyone else carry, which communicated something about what it contained without requiring explanation. She looked at Noah when they fell into the movement toward the LZ. She didn't say anything for the first 3 minutes. Then, how many? 4 positions, he said, all down. She absorbed this. Any trouble? He thought about the right edge of a rock formation and a 15-centimeter window in a shot that most snipers on Earth could not have made. Minor complication, he said. Handled. She made a sound that might have been a short, dry laugh. Of course. Evelyn moved them fast toward the LZ, a flat area of rocky ground approximately 40 meters across, adequate for helicopter operations in clear conditions, marginal in anything else. The sky above it was clear. The stars were hard and specific in the high-altitude dark. Noah marked the weather with the part of his brain that was always tracking environmental variables and found nothing alarming yet. LZ in sight, Rael said. 200 meters. Chew, collapse in, Evelyn said. From the north, moving quickly and quietly down the slope, Chew's silhouette appeared and integrated with the element without drama. He took the left flank without being told, which was where he should be, and he knew it. At the LZ perimeter, Evelyn keyed the SATCOM. Extraction, this is Raven. LZ is cold. We have the package. Confirm inbound. A pause. Distant static. Then a voice through the encrypted net that was professionally neutral and carried the background rumble of rotors. Raven, confirmed. Inbound. 11 minutes. Copy. LZ is marked on my signal. She activated the IR beacon, invisible to the naked eye, vivid to any night vision system on the approaching aircraft. She set it in the center of the LZ and moved back to the perimeter. The element established a defensive perimeter automatically, each operator moving to a position that covered an approach vector, spacing managed without conversation. Reeves was in the center, seated on a rock with her pack between her knees, doing something with her hands that Noah couldn't see from where he was. Voss moved to Noah's position, close enough to speak without the radio. She gonna make it? She's already made it, Noah said. She made it 6 days ago. We just opened the door. Voss looked out at the dark. Chew. He'll carry it, Noah said. He should, but he'll carry it right. You sure? He thought about a young operator making the only honest assessment he could make when asked his confidence level. 60%. Not inflating it, not hiding from it, just the number, because the number was what mattered. Yeah, he said, I'm sure. The 11 minutes ran in the specific way that final waits ran in hostile environments, stretched and compressed simultaneously, each minute containing its own complete architecture of attention. Noah watched his sector and listened to the mountain and thought about nothing in particular, which was the skill that his training had taken longest to develop. The ability to be genuinely present without being consumed by presence. At the 9-minute mark, Chew spoke on the net, quiet and tight. Movement. Northern approach. 2. No. 3 personnel. 300 meters. Nobody on the perimeter moved. The perimeter was already established, already covering the northern approach. Evelyn said, Weapons free if they close to 200. Hold until then. The three figures on the northern slope stopped. They'd seen the IR beacon, probably, or heard something, felt something, that patrol instinct that told experienced fighters the ground ahead was not as empty as it looked. They stopped for 45 seconds that felt considerably longer than that. Then they turned back. Noah let out a breath he hadn't quite been aware of holding. 6 minutes, Rael said, tracking the helo. They'll be back with more, Chu said. When they figure out the overwatch positions aren't responding. We'll be gone, Evelyn said. She would be right, or she wouldn't. That was the nature of 6 minutes. The helicopter came in fast and low from the southwest, flared hard over the LZ and set down with the controlled aggression of a crew that had been briefed on the time constraint and taken it seriously. The rotors didn't spin down. The crew chief was out of the door before the skids fully settled, moving to receive Reeves with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Reeves moved to the aircraft under her own power. She paused at the door, looked back at the element, at Evelyn specifically, and said something that was swallowed by the rotor noise. Evelyn nodded once. Whatever it was enough. They loaded in 15 seconds. The aircraft was lifting before the last boot cleared the ground. Noah looked through the aircraft's porthole as the LZ dropped away. The flat rocky ground, the IR beacon still pulsing in the center, the dark mountain slopes folding back into the larger darkness of the range. He watched until the LZ disappeared into the terrain, and then he watched the terrain until it disappeared into the general darkness below. Across the cargo bay, Chu sat with his eyes open and his hands loose on his knees. Not sleeping. Looking at a fixed point on the opposite bulkhead that didn't exist. His jaw was set in the particular way of someone who was having an extremely focused internal conversation that they weren't going to share. Evelyn was seated at the forward end of the cargo bay. She had her data book open. She was writing. Noah watched her write for a moment. The small, precise notations in a physical notebook by the dim cargo bay lighting, and thought about 14 years of field records, about the manual that instructors were currently teaching from, in ranges and training environments that didn't know where the material came from, about a concrete block in the Nevada desert and a sealed envelope that stayed sealed because someone decided they already knew what it would say. Rael leaned over from the adjacent seat. He had to put his mouth close to Noah's ear to be heard over the rotor noise. Hell of a shot she made on the saddle. Yeah. You see the window she had? I heard it from Chu, Noah said. 15 centimeters. Rael sat back. He shook his head once, not a negative, just the physical expression of something that didn't have a better outlet. Then he looked at the forward end of the cargo bay. Evelyn had stopped writing. She was looking at the dark porthole beside her, not at her reflection, past it, at the mountain they'd just left. Her expression was not the expression of someone reviewing a successful operation. It was the expression of someone doing the quiet, private accounting that followed whenever the outcome had been good, but the path to it had included a moment where it could easily have been otherwise. She'd moved across 500 meters of broken mountain terrain in pitch dark and made a partial exposure shot at 800 meters to close a gap that one missed shot had opened. She'd done it without hesitation, without announcement, without any of the apparatus of drama. She'd simply identified what needed doing and done it, the way she appeared to do everything. But she was sitting with the porthole now the way people sat when the thing they'd been running on was wearing off, and what was left was the weight of it. Noah looked away. Some accountings were private. He'd learned that. You let people have them. The aircraft banked south. The mountains fell away beneath them, and the desert opened up ahead, flat and enormous and lit by stars. And somewhere far below, in an installation that didn't appear on any public map, Colonel Marcus Hale was probably still awake, probably sitting in his office, probably looking at the unsealed contents of a tan envelope and recalculating the cost of what he'd decided he already knew. The helo flew south through the cold, high air, carrying 6 people and whatever they were each carrying inside them, toward a landing strip that would end one thing and begin another. And the stars above the desert were hard and indifferent and very far away, and the night held all of it without comment, the way nights in desert country always did. The landing strip at Iron Mesa came up out of the desert dark at 0347, the blue taxiway lights marking its edges the way they had when they'd left, as though the installation had simply held its breath for 6 hours and was only now releasing it. The helicopter set down hard. The crew was tired. The aircraft had been running since before midnight, and the precision of the approach reflected that. Nobody complained. Hard landings on friendly ground were a category of problem that nobody on that aircraft had the energy to care about. The ramp dropped. The night air came in, dry and cold and smelling of the desert, and Noah stepped down onto the asphalt and felt the specific solidity of level ground under his boots, in a way that he didn't usually notice and was noticing now. Behind him, Voss and Rael and Chu came down the ramp. Reeves came last, moving with the assisted gait of someone whose leg had been through too much, and was communicating that clearly, supported by the crew chief who handed her off at the bottom of the ramp to a two-person medical team that had been waiting on the tarmac. She didn't look fragile. She looked like someone who had made an extended series of very difficult decisions and was now allowing, within the constraints of her dignity, for other people to help with the physical management of the consequences. She spoke briefly to one of the medics, something Noah couldn't hear, and then she was moving toward the medical facility, and the tarmac absorbed that part of the night and moved on. Evelyn came down the ramp last. She had her rifle case in her right hand and her data book in her left, and she stood on the tarmac for a moment looking at the installation. The low prefab structures, the range lights in the distance, the administrative buildings with their windows dark except for one. On the second floor, where the light was on, General Mercer was waiting at the edge of the tarmac with two aides and a vehicle. He didn't come forward. He waited, which was its own form of communication. The acknowledgement that the team needed the 10 seconds of walking toward him rather than having him arrive at them. When they reached him, he looked at each operator in turn. Not a formal inspection. The look of a man who had sent people into situations and was counting them back. "Reeves?" he said. "Alive and mobile," Evelyn said. "Left leg wound manageable." She maintained her kit. Mercer nodded once. Something in his face shifted in a way that was not quite relief but was in the neighborhood of it. "The network?" 4 positions, all down. Complications? A fractional pause. 1 position required a secondary engagement. Mercer looked at her steadily. He'd been in the business long enough to understand what secondary engagement meant in this context. It meant something hadn't gone to plan, and that the correction had been sufficient, and that everyone standing on this tarmac was evidence of that. He didn't press it. "Debrief at 0600, he said. "Get cleaned up, get some food. I want full accounts while it's fresh." He looked at the 4 operators. "Good work." He said it the way men of his experience said things like that, without inflation, without performance, as a statement of fact that he happened to be communicating aloud. He turned toward the vehicle. Then he stopped and turned back. "Hale wants to be in the debrief," he said. He was looking at Evelyn when he said it. She didn't react visibly. "That's your call, sir." "I know it is, he said. "I'm telling you because I thought you should know before you walk in the room." A pause. "He's been up since we left." Evelyn looked at the lit window on the second floor of the administrative building. "I figured," she said. The 2 hours between landing and debrief were the particular kind of time that existed in operational context. Not rest, not work, but the pressurized limbo of a mission that was technically complete but not yet fully processed. Noah showered, ate something from the facility's 24-hour food station that he would not later be able to remember, and sat on the edge of his bunk in the transient quarters going through his data book. He did this after every significant engagement. It was not a ritual in any ceremonial sense. It was functional, the way a mechanic logs what happened to an engine under stress, so that future maintenance can be informed by actual performance rather than assumed performance. He wrote what he'd seen at position 3. The thermal layer in the Mirage, the adjustment he'd made on his own, the quarter-mil correction, and why he'd made it. The shot, the outcome. He wrote it in plain language. What he saw, what he decided, what happened. At the bottom of the entry, he wrote 3 words that he didn't entirely plan to write. "She taught me." He looked at that for a moment, then closed the book. Down the hall, behind a closed door, he could hear Chu. Not words, just the quality of presence that someone had when they were awake and not moving, which was different from sleep, different from rest. Chu was sitting with something that wasn't going to resolve in 2 hours, and probably wasn't going to resolve in 2 days. The miss. The near transmission. The 6 minutes that had required someone else to fix what he hadn't. Noah thought about going and knocking on the door. He thought about it for about 30 seconds, then didn't. Not because it wasn't the right thing, it might have been, but because Chu needed to be with it first. Some things required sitting with them alone before another person's presence helped, rather than interfered. He knew this because he'd been Chu, in a different operation, in a different country, sitting with a different miss that had different consequences. He'd needed the alone time. What came after had been better for it. He lay back on the bunk and looked at the ceiling and did not sleep. The debrief room was the same briefing structure they'd used the previous afternoon, now fully lit and smelling of coffee that had been sitting too long. 6 chairs had been arranged in a rough semicircle facing a whiteboard. The whiteboard had the operation's basic framework sketched on it. A map of the target area, the 4 position locations marked, the LZ marked, the exfil route. Mercer was already seated when they came in. His 2 aides were at a side table with recording equipment and laptops. At the far end of the semicircle, in the chair closest to the door, Colonel Marcus Hale was seated with his back straight and his hands on his knees and the expression of a man who had decided, carefully and with effort, exactly what expression he was going to wear into this room. He looked at Evelyn when she came in. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything. They sat down. Mercer ran the debrief in the order that debriefs ran: chronological, factual, each operator giving their account of their phase of the operation, the other accounts building on and sometimes correcting the one before. He was a skilled debriefer in the way that experienced commanders sometimes were. He asked questions that opened things up rather than closing them down, and he had the patience to wait for complete answers rather than accepting the first version of something that sounded adequate. Voss went first. Position 1. 1,840 meters, first round hit, confirmed down. Her account was clean and direct. The account of someone for whom the operation had gone exactly as planned. Ryle next. Position 2, the repositioned target, 2,060 meters, accounting for the updated data Evelyn had provided. First round hit, confirmed. One observation: the repositioned location had slightly better cover than the original mapped position, which had not affected the outcome but would have affected it if the angle had been less favorable. He noted it as intelligence for future planning purposes. Noah gave his account. Position 3, 1,980 meters, the thermal layer observation, the unilateral adjustment, the outcome. He reported it plainly, including the fact that the adjustment had not been part of the data package he'd been given and that he had made it on his own read of the environment. Mercer stopped him there. You deviated from the provided fire solution. I modified the elevation component, sir, fractionally. The wind solution and base range were unchanged, based on a thermal layer I observed in the mirage at mid-range. Chief Warrant Officer Cross mentioned the phenomenon at the observation position, the layer above the northern saddle. I identified what appeared to be a similar feature at approximately 800 meters in my sector and made an adjustment consistent with what she'd described. Mercer considered this, and if the adjustment had been wrong, then I'd have missed, sir, and we'd have had 2 positions requiring secondary engagement. Mercer wrote something on the legal pad in front of him. He didn't comment further. He looked at Chu. Chu sat forward in his chair with his forearms on his knees. He'd been sitting that way since the debrief started. Not defensive, not collapsed, but the posture of someone who had decided the correct approach to this room was to lean into it. Position 4, Mercer said. 2,200 meters approximately. 2,230, Chu said. Sir? He paused. First shot missed. I pulled left. The wind shifted in the last second of the firing sequence, and I didn't account for it. My hold was already placed for the stable condition, and I didn't read the shift in time. He said it without hesitation, without the softening language that people sometimes used when describing their own errors. Second shot also missed. Chief Warrant Officer Cross's guidance on the correction was accurate. I had overcorrected on the left hold. But by the time I fired the second round, the target had taken cover. The round was clean ballistically, but there was no exposure. He paused again. CWO Cross moved to a secondary position and neutralized the target before he could transmit. The room was quiet for a moment. At approximately 800 meters, Mercer said. Yes, sir. Partial exposure. Approximately 15 centimeters. Mercer looked at Evelyn. She was looking at the whiteboard. Hale spoke for the first time since the debrief started. His voice was level and controlled and carried the careful quality of words that had been selected rather than generated. What was the time elapsed between Warrant Officer Chu's second shot and your engagement of the target? Evelyn looked at him. 43 seconds. And the check-in cycle window at that point. We were at 5 minutes 8 seconds when the target was neutralized. The cycle was 6 minutes. 52 seconds of margin, Hale said. Yes. That's not much margin. No, she said. It isn't. The exchange had the quality of two people communicating about more than the specific numbers they were discussing. Hale had spent the night in the lit office on the second floor of the administrative building and had arrived at this debrief having run his own accounting, not of the mission, which he hadn't been part of, but of everything that had led to it. The sealed envelope, the range, the dismissal, what it had cost, what it had almost cost, what the margin between those two things actually was. Mercer looked at his notes. CWO Cross, your account of the secondary engagement. Evelyn gave it. Clean, factual, in the same unadorned language the others had used. She described the movement to the southern approach, the geometry of the shot, the observation of the target's decision to reach for the radio. She described the adjustment, elevation for the uphill angle, and the result. She described the movement to the LZ and the exfil. When she finished, Mercer said, "The data book notation for a shot like that. Have you made it?" "Yes, sir." "I'd like a copy of the relevant entry for the program record." She reached into her shirt pocket and placed the data book on the table in front of him. He didn't pick it up immediately. He looked at it for a moment, then nodded and set it aside. "Questions," he said, addressing the room. "Not an invitation, an inventory. If something needed addressing, now was the time." Hale said, "I have one." He was looking at Evelyn. "The team selection, Pierce. You chose him because of a question he asked, and because of the way he'd been watching you on the range. That's an unconventional selection criterion." "Yes," she said. "Walk me through it." She looked at Hale steadily. "Every other operator on your range this morning looked at the problem the same way when it stopped working. They looked at their data, confirmed it was right, and concluded the environment was wrong. That's a reasonable response. It's also a dead end, because the environment doesn't care whether you've concluded it's wrong." She paused. Pierce looked at the data, confirmed it was right, and then went looking for what he was missing. That's a different response. It requires a specific kind of intellectual honesty, the willingness to consider that the correct data and the correct answer are not the same thing. Hale absorbed this. And tonight, the unilateral adjustment on his fire solution demonstrates the same thing. He saw a feature in the environment that his provided data didn't account for, trusted the read, and made the adjustment. He was right. She looked at Hale directly. "I gave him the framework for reading that feature earlier in the day. He applied it on his own, under pressure, at night, at extreme range. That's not luck and it's not coincidence. That's someone who takes instruction seriously." Hale was quiet for a moment. "And Chu?" The name landed differently. Evelyn kept her gaze on Hale. "He identified a legitimate risk assessment on the mountain that I confirmed was valid," she said. "His miss was a wind read error under difficult conditions at extreme range. It happens." She paused. "His report of the miss just now was accurate and unvarnished. He told you exactly what happened without trying to soften it. That's harder than the shot." Chu, in his chair, didn't move. But something in his posture shifted in a small way that wasn't visible so much as felt by the people in the room who were paying attention. "He'll be a better shooter because of tonight," Evelyn said. "He already is." Mercer looked up from his notes. "Hale, you had something else." It wasn't a question. He'd seen the thing building in Hale's expression since the debrief started. Not the technical questions, which were legitimate and had been asked, but something beneath them that had been waiting for a different kind of space. Hale stood up. It was not a dramatic gesture. He didn't address the room, didn't square his shoulders in the way of a man making a formal statement. He stood up the way someone stood when they'd been sitting with something heavy for a long time and the sitting had become insufficient. He looked at Evelyn. "I dismissed you," he said, "in front of 40 operators. I didn't read the orders because I decided I already knew what they would say." He paused. Not searching for words, he'd had hours to find them, but managing the act of saying them in a room with witnesses. That was wrong. It was wrong on the merits because the orders would have clarified the situation.
It was wrong on principle because I let what I assumed override what I was being asked to verify. Another pause. I owe you an apology. I'm giving it now. The room was quiet in the particular way of rooms where something real had just been said. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. Her expression was not warm, and it was not cold. It was the expression of someone measuring a thing against an honest standard. I accept it, she said. Hale sat back down. Nobody in the room made any kind of acknowledging noise or gesture, which was the correct response, and everyone present understood it as such. Mercer closed his legal pad. Final items. Mission outcome is classified at the program level. Standard compartmentalization applies. No written communication, no verbal discussion outside of cleared channels. As far as any external record is concerned, last night's operation did not occur. He looked around the room. Reeves is in medical. She'll be debriefed separately once she's stable. Her kit is being processed through the intelligence chain. He stood. Pierce, Voss, Rail, Chu, transport back to your respective home stations is arranged for 1400 today. Any administrative issues, see my aide. He picked up the data book from the table. CWO Cross, stay! The operators filed out. Hale stood, gathered his things, and moved toward the door. At the threshold he stopped, with his back to the room, and said, without turning, "For what it's worth. Watching the demonstration yesterday. I've been running this program for 3 years. I've never seen shooting like that." He went through the door. The room held Mercer and Evelyn and the long-burning coffee smell and the morning light beginning to show around the edges of the blackout curtains. Mercer set the data book on the table in front of Evelyn. "That entry," he said. 800 meters, partial exposure. "It was the shot that was there," she said. "I took it." "I've been in this business since you were in high school," Mercer said. "I've read every field record associated with your call sign. I've seen the documentation from 14 deployments." He paused. "I've never seen that shot listed anywhere." "Because I've never had to take it before," she said. He sat back. He looked at her with the expression of a man deciding how honestly to say something. "You took a 100% commitment shot through a 15-centimeter window at 800 meters in the dark to close a gap that wouldn't have existed if the team selection had been perfect." "The selection was as good as I could make it," she said. "The miss wasn't a selection failure. It was a wind read error. They happen." "I know they happen," Mercer said. "I'm not criticizing the selection." He paused. "I'm trying to understand something. The shot you made. Most people in your position would have told Chu to keep trying, given him another attempt, bought time." "Buying time wasn't available," she said. "He'd taken 2 shots and the target was in hard cover and reaching for a radio. Another attempt from Chu's position had low probability of a better outcome. Moving to the southern approach gave me better geometry and lower range. It was the correct tactical decision." "You weren't certain you'd make the shot." A beat. "No," she said. "I wasn't." "But you went anyway." "Someone had to." Mercer was quiet for a moment. "The program," he said. "Iron Mesa, the curriculum, the doctrine, the selection criteria. You've been aware for some time that your field records form the basis of most of the advanced material." "I became aware," she said carefully. "I didn't design it that way." "I know, that's not—" He stopped. He picked up the data book, turned it over in his hands. "I'm asking because there's a proposal on my desk. Has been for 6 months. A formal role. Program director level. Not a field role, advisory, curriculum, selection oversight. The kind of role where the knowledge you carry gets institutionalized instead of classified." He set the book down. "Iron Mesa would be a different program if the person who wrote the doctrine was running the program." Evelyn looked at the data book. She looked at the whiteboard with the operation sketched on it. She looked at the coffee on the side table that nobody had touched. "I'm not done in the field," she said. "I know. That's not me being resistant to the idea. I'm telling you where I am." "I know where you are," Mercer said. "That's why it's been on my desk for 6 months and not on yours." He paused. "I'm not asking for a decision today. I'm telling you it's there. It'll still be there when you're ready." She picked up the data book. "Reeves's kit," she said, "the intelligence she was carrying. Is it intact?" "Initial assessment says yes. Then last night accomplished what it was supposed to accomplish." She stood. "The debrief is solid. Your operators gave you accurate accounts, particularly Chu." "I noticed," Mercer said.
You gave him something in there, the thing you said about the report being harder than the shot. It's true. I know it's true. I'm saying it landed. He'll carry that. He looked at her. You know that. She picked up her rifle case. I know how to teach, she said. It wasn't modesty and it wasn't pride. It was the plain statement of a person accounting honestly for what they were capable of. I've been doing it the whole time, just not inside a building. She moved toward the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame, not dramatically, just the natural pause of someone who'd thought of something. Hale's apology, she said without turning. It was genuine. I know, Mercer said. He's a good program director. His standards are correct. His doctrine is sound. She paused. His problem is that he built a ceiling for himself out of what he already knew and then stopped looking above it. Another pause. That's fixable, if he decides to fix it. She went through the door. Noah was at the food station when he heard boots on the hallway floor and looked up to find Evelyn crossing the common area with her rifle case and her data book, moving toward the exit with the same unhurried certainty she'd had since he'd first watched her cross a gravel parking lot in the Nevada heat. He said, "Ma'am." She stopped. He didn't have a specific question prepared. He'd been sitting with the night the way you sat with something you hadn't fully sorted yet, and the question that came out was not the one he would have chosen if he'd had more time to choose it. The data book, he said. How long have you been keeping it? She looked at him. Since my third deployment, she said, 14 years. And the entries, the ones that became the manual. They weren't written to become anything, she said. They were written because I needed to understand what I was doing and why it was working. Writing it down was how I checked my own thinking. She paused. That's still why I keep it. He nodded. He thought about his own data book, the entry he'd made before the debrief, the 3 words at the bottom of the page. The adjustment I made tonight, he said, the $250,000. I wasn't certain. I know. You couldn't have known from... You came back from that position and your data book was open to a new entry before you'd been on the ground for 20 minutes, she said. Certain people do that. Uncertain people either don't write it down or wait until they've convinced themselves they were right. She looked at him steadily. You wrote it before you knew the outcome. That tells me what I need to know about the certainty question. He absorbed this. Outside, through the facility's small windows, the desert was beginning to show its first gray light. Not sunrise yet, but the suggestion of it, the darkest color of the sky beginning to separate from the blackest. What happens to Chu? He said. What do you mean? What happens to him? The miss. In his record. Evelyn set her rifle case down. Nothing in his record that doesn't belong there. The miss is documented. So is the correction. So is the debrief account he gave this morning. She paused. His record is going to show a young operator who encountered a difficult condition, made an error, reported it accurately and completely, and continued to function. That's not a record that hurts a career. She looked at Noah. The records that hurt careers are the ones where the error is there and the honest account isn't. He'll want to talk to you, Noah said. I know. She picked up the rifle case. He'll know where to find me. She moved toward the exit. Noah watched her go. The worn rifle case, the data book, the plain gray long sleeve despite the desert morning, the boots that had seen serious mileage. She pushed through the facility door, and the thin gray light of the early desert morning took her, and the door swung closed behind her. Noah stood in the common area with his coffee and the quiet of a building full of people who were all, in their different ways, sitting with the same night. He thought about Chu behind his closed door. He thought about Hale in the lit office on the second floor. He thought about Reeves in the medical facility, getting her leg properly attended to, with her kit in the intelligence chain doing whatever it was going to do that would never be discussed in any room he'd be cleared for. He thought about a sealed envelope on a concrete block in the Nevada desert, and the specific cost of the decision not to open it. Then he thought about what Evelyn had said in the debrief, not the part about him, though he'd carry that, but the part about Hale, that his problem was a ceiling he'd built out of what he already knew, that it was fixable. The desert outside the window was getting lighter. Not fast. The way deserts got light was gradual and then sudden, a long gray preparation followed by a specific moment when the sun cleared the eastern ridge and the whole landscape changed color at once. He'd seen it before from ranges and patrol bases and the windows of various vehicles moving through various deserts in various parts of the world. He was still thinking about ceilings when the light changed. The sun cleared the eastern ridge at 0614, and the desert went from gray to copper in the space of about 30 seconds, the way it always did, the way Noah had seen it do in enough places that it no longer surprised him, but still, every time, made him stop whatever he was doing for the few seconds it took. He was still at the food station. His coffee had gone cold. He hadn't noticed. He poured it out and got a fresh cup and stood at the window watching the light change on the hard pan and thought about ceilings and floors and the specific distance between where a person was and where they were capable of being, and whether that distance was fixed or whether it was a choice that got made, incrementally, in the small decisions that didn't feel like decisions at the time. He was still standing there when he heard the door down the hall open and close, and footsteps, and then Chu appeared in the entrance to the common area. The younger man looked like someone who hadn't slept, which he hadn't, and who had been having a long conversation with himself, which he had, and who had arrived at something on the other side of it, which remained to be seen. He looked at Noah. Coffee? Machine's over there. Chu crossed to the machine, filled a cup, and stood next to Noah at the window. They watched the desert for a moment. Two men in a common room at the end of a long night, holding cups they were barely drinking from. She's gone? Chu said. Left about 20 minutes ago. Chu nodded. He'd expected it, probably. I wanted to... He stopped. Started again. I wanted to ask her something. What? Chu turned the cup in his hands. Whether she ever missed, before last night, in a real situation. Not a qual, not a training range. Whether she ever put around somewhere it wasn't supposed to go when it actually mattered. Noah considered this. What would you have done with the answer? Depended on the answer, Chu said. And if it was yes? Chu was quiet for a moment. Then I'd know it's survivable. Noah looked at him. The morning light was doing what morning light did to faces that had been awake all night, flattening them slightly, exposing the tiredness without the social layer that daylight hours usually maintained. Chu looked young in a way that he probably didn't most of the time and wouldn't want to know he looked right now. It's survivable, Noah said. You don't know... I know, Noah said. I don't need her biography to tell you that. He paused. She didn't build what she built because she never missed. She built it because of what she did after. Chu looked at the window. Outside, a dust devil was forming on the hard pan, small, spinning itself up from nothing, moving northwest. The debrief, he said. The thing she said. About the report being harder than the shot. Yeah. She meant it as, I don't know. It didn't feel like she was letting me off anything. It felt more like she was telling me something specific. She was, Noah said. She was telling you that the way you handle the accounting matters as much as the performance. Maybe more. He drank his coffee. You gave them an accurate account, no hedging. You could have framed the wind shift as more significant than it was. You didn't. The wind shift was real, Chu said. It was just, I should have read it in time. I had enough training to read it, and I didn't. He said it flatly. Not self-punishment, just the precise location of the error stated clearly. That's the part I keep coming back to. It wasn't an impossible condition. It was a hard condition that I had the tools to handle and didn't handle. Then that's what you work on, Noah said. Chu looked at him. That's it? What else would it be? The younger man absorbed this. It wasn't the answer that resolved everything. It wasn't meant to be. But it was the answer that pointed toward the next thing, which was what was actually needed at 0620 in the morning after a night like the one they'd had. The large resolution could wait. The next thing was available right now. Chu drank his coffee. I'd have never gotten that second position from where I was, he said. The angle was bad, and the target was in hard cover. Even if I'd made a perfect adjustment, the exposure was gone. I know. She knew it too. That's why she moved. Yes, and she made the shot. He shook his head, not in disbelief exactly, but in the particular way of someone recalibrating their understanding of what was possible. 15 centimeters? 800 meters. In the dark. Don't make it mythology, Noah said. That's not useful to you. Chu looked at him. What do you mean? I mean, she made that shot because of 14 years of field records and the specific geometry of the southern approach and a read of the target's behavior that told her he was about to transmit. He paused. Not because she's something other than human, because she did the work and read the situation and trusted the read, The same thing she spent all day yesterday telling everyone else to do. He looked at Chu. That's the part you take from it. Not the mythology. The process. Chu was quiet for a long moment. Then, quietly, she chose me for this. Knowing I was the youngest. Knowing I'd never run a live engagement at that range. She chose you because she saw something, Noah said. The 60% call. When she asked your confidence and you gave her the real number instead of the number that would have made you look better. That's why you're here. Chu put his cup down on the counter. He stared at it. And the miss is in your record, Noah said. Right next to the accurate debrief account. Those two things live together. People who matter will read both. Outside, the dust devil had grown and was moving faster now, pulling desert dust into a column that caught the copper morning light. It would collapse in another minute. They always did. But for the moment, it was vivid and specific and entirely real. 80900, Colonel Marcus Hale walked across the tarmac to the medical facility. He hadn't told anyone he was going. His aide had offered to accompany him, and he'd said no, which his aide understood as meaning something more than a simple preference for privacy. Hale walked across the tarmac in the full morning heat, which was building quickly now that the sun was up, and his shadow stretched long behind him on the asphalt. Captain Diane Reeves was in the second room on the left, sitting up in a medical cot with her leg elevated and properly dressed and her kit, a hard-sided case that she had not allowed out of arm's reach since the helicopter, on the floor beside her. She had eaten. She had slept for 3 hours, which a person in her condition needed more than conversation, but which her operational instincts had apparently allowed. She looked up when Hale knocked on the open door frame. "Colonel?" she said. Her voice was steady. It was the voice of someone who had been through something significant and was now on the other side of it, and had the particular clarity that sometimes came from that position. "Captain." He came in, stopped at a respectful distance. "I'm not here officially. I wanted to see that you were—" He paused, finding the right word. "Intact." She considered him. "Intact is a reasonable description." She looked at the case on the floor. "The kit is in the chain?" "Since 0430. She nodded. A long exhale that was probably not entirely about the kit. 6 days is a long time to sit on a mountain. I imagine it is. The team that came in, she said, you know them. They qualified on my range, Hale said, yesterday morning. He paused at the strangeness of that. Yesterday morning, the range, the dismissal, the demonstration, the mountain, the return, the debrief, all of it compressed into a single operational day that felt like it had occurred across a much larger span of time. CWO Cross led the element. Reeves looked at him steadily. I know who she is. Most people don't, not specifically. I've been in intelligence for 8 years, Reeves said. I know the call sign. I know enough of the record. She paused. When she came forward to make initial contact, I'd been alone for 6 days and I was not at my best. She came up the south slope and said my name and said she had a corridor. A pause. The way she said it, not like it was a question, not like she was checking, like it was a fact she was delivering. Reeves looked at the window. I've been in situations where people come to help you and you can tell they're afraid. It's in the way they move, the way they talk. You can feel it. It transfers. And her. Nothing transferred, Reeves said. Just the corridor, just the fact of it. Hale was quiet for a moment. She's been doing this for 14 years, he said. Apparently. I know. I didn't know, he said, yesterday morning, when she arrived at the range. I didn't know. And I didn't open the orders that would have told me, and I dismissed her in front of 40 operators. He said it the way he'd said it in the debrief. Not performing contrition, just stating the fact of it, because the fact of it was what required stating. I've been running this program for 3 years, and I thought I understood what exceptional looked like. I was wrong. Reeves looked at him. You were wrong about her specifically, she said. Not necessarily about everything else. The distinction matters to you? It should matter to you, she said. A person who's wrong about one thing and uses it to conclude they're wrong about everything is as useless as a person who's wrong about one thing and doesn't change anything. The useful response is narrower than that. Hale absorbed this. He wasn't sure what he'd expected from this conversation, possibly more difficulty.
The woman had spent 6 days on a hostile mountain with a leg wound because of an intelligence operation, had been extracted by a team led by someone he'd publicly dismissed 24 hours ago, and was now lying in a medical cot telling him the useful response to his error was a narrow one. She was not wrong. She was also not gentle about it, which he found, unexpectedly, easier to receive than gentleness would have been. The program, he said, what she built, the doctrine, the curriculum. I've been teaching from it for 3 years without knowing where it came from. Does it change how you'll teach it? He thought about this honestly. I don't know yet, he said. It might change why. Reeves looked at him for a moment, measuring something. She came up that slope, she said, and she got me out of the mountain. Whatever happened between you on that range, whatever she thought about it, it didn't change how she ran the mission. It didn't affect the element or the decision-making or the outcome. She paused. That's a specific kind of discipline. Not forgiving you, just not letting what you did take up space in the mission. I know, Hale said. I'm not sure you do, she said. Not unkindly. But you might, in time. He stood there for another moment. Then he said, Is there anything you need? From the facility. Sleep, she said, and for someone to make sure that case gets where it's going. Both are handled. Then I'm fine, Colonel. She settled back against the pillow. Thank you for coming. He walked back across the tarmac in the full morning heat, and his shadow was shorter now, and the hard pan shimmered with the first real heat of the day, and he walked all the way back to his office and sat down and looked at the sealed envelope that was no longer sealed and thought about what Reeves had said. Not forgiving, just not letting it take up space. He'd been carrying his certainty like ballast for 3 years. Useful weight, he'd thought, stabilizing. What he was beginning to understand, slowly, in the specific way that things understood themselves when they could no longer be avoided, was that ballast and anchor were different things, and he had been treating them as the same. He picked up the phone and called his aide. Get me the program curriculum files, he said. All of them, the full archive. A pause on the other end. Sir, there are several thousand pages. I know how many pages there are, Hale said. I want them on my desk. I'm going to read them again. But Noah's transport was a military charter, wheels up at 1400, destination Fort Campbell. He sat in a window seat with his data book open and the desert sliding past below him as the aircraft climbed and banked east. He'd said goodbye to Voss and Rael at the airfield. Brief, professional, the goodbye of people who understood they might work together again or might not. That the nature of the work meant you held the connections lightly because the connections had a tendency to reconfigure without notice. Voss had shaken his hand and said, Good shooting last night. And he'd said, You too. And that had been sufficient. Rael had given him a card with a personal email address on it, which was Rael's way of saying something more than goodbye without saying it in words, and Noah had put it in his shirt pocket. Chu had been at the airfield but slightly apart from the group, standing near the fence with his gear at his feet and his eyes on the middle distance. Noah had walked over. Fort Bragg? Noah said. Fort Bragg, Chu confirmed. Different bird than mine. Yeah. Chu looked at him. Pierce. Last night. The way she moved to that southern approach. She didn't hesitate. No communication, just movement. How do you get to a place where you can make a call like that with that kind of... He searched for the word, certainty. Noah thought about it. I don't think it's certainty, he said. I think it's acceptance. She'd already accepted every version of the outcome, including the bad ones. So the decision about what to do wasn't cluttered up by trying to avoid a result she hadn't accepted yet. Chu considered this. That's a different way to think about it. It's the way she thinks about it, Noah said, or the closest I can get to it from the outside. Chu nodded slowly. I'm going to request the advanced wind reading course when I get back, he said. The one that runs out of Bragg. It's a 3-week thing, very small cohort. Good. And I'm going to write the entry, Chu said. For last night, the miss and everything after. I've been putting it off. Write it before you land, Noah said, while it's still honest. Chu picked up his gear. His transport was being called. He looked at Noah for a moment. The look of someone who had more to say and had decided the saying of it would keep for another time, if there was another time, and if there wasn't, then it was the kind of thing that didn't require saying. He nodded once, picked up his bag, walked toward his aircraft.
Noah watched him go, then walked to his own. What? Now, at altitude, with the desert giving way to scrubland and then to the brown-green geography of the southwest. Beginning to shift towards something greener, Noah wrote the full entry for position 3. He'd written the initial notes before the debrief. Now he wrote the complete version. Everything, in sequence, including the weight and the cold and the heartbeat he'd been aware of, and the thermal layer in the mirage and the decision to make one more adjustment. He wrote, "I was not certain. I made the adjustment because the read was there and the read was honest. The shot worked. I don't know if it would have worked if the adjustment had been wrong. That question doesn't have an answer, and I'm leaving it here because I want to remember that it existed." He read that back. Then he kept writing. He wrote about Evelyn Cross, not as a character study, not as an appreciation. He wrote about what he'd observed over a 20-hour period, the specific behaviors and decisions that constituted evidence of something he was trying to understand. He wrote about the concrete block and the unsealed envelope and the range demonstration and the mountain. He wrote about the data book she'd been keeping for 14 years and the curriculum that had come from it, and the commanders and program directors who had been teaching from it without knowing its origin. He wrote, "The thing that made her the best in the room was not that she was immune to the pressures that affected everyone else. She wasn't. She sat with that porthole on the aircraft for a long time after the mission. She was doing the accounting the way everyone else does the accounting, alone, in the quiet that comes after. The difference is what she does on the other side of it. She writes it down, she makes it usable. She turns the experience into the next capability instead of carrying it as weight." He paused, looked out the window at the geography below, which had gone green now. The scrubland had given way to actual country, rolling and specific. He wrote one more thing, the sealed envelope. She handed it to him twice. He didn't open it. "I keep thinking about that. Not about Hale, but about the sealed envelopes I've been handed in my own career and not opened. The ones I decided I already knew what they contained. I don't know what was in those. I never will." That's a different kind of cost than the one Hale paid, because his was immediate and visible, and mine are just absences. Things that didn't happen that might have. He closed the book. Outside the window, the land below was green and particular and entirely itself, moving past at the speed of a military charter climbing to cruise altitude, which was not the speed of anything else, and had no equivalent in any other context. He watched it for a while. 3 weeks after the operation, a package arrived at Evelyn Cross's home address, a small house outside Fayetteville that she owned and occupied between deployments, which was not often, but more often than it used to be. The package was mailed from Iron Mesa's administrative address, which she recognized. Inside was a copy of the program curriculum, not the classified version, but the unclassified framework document, the foundational text from which instructors built their course material. On the cover page, in handwriting she recognized from a signature on range documentation she'd seen once, 3 years ago, someone had written, "Reading it again." Some of it differently than before. No name. Hale didn't sign it because the handwriting was signature enough for anyone paying attention, and Evelyn Cross had been paying attention since the morning she'd walked onto his range. She set it on her kitchen table. She made coffee. She sat down and opened it to the first page, which was a statement of program philosophy, the foundational principles that governed everything the curriculum built on top of. She read it. Some of it was exactly right. Some of it was close to right, but angled slightly wrong, in the way of things that had been adapted from field records by people who hadn't been in the field when the records were made. She got a pencil from the drawer by the sink. She sat back down. She started making notes in the margins. Not revisions, observations. The specific places where the written doctrine intersected with her actual experience and where the intersection was clean and where it wasn't. She wrote in the same small, precise hand she used in the data book, the same economy of language, the same preference for the specific over the general. She worked through 30 pages before her coffee was gone. She got up, made more coffee, sat back down. The house was quiet around her, the particular quiet of a place that had been empty more than it had been occupied, that held the quality of waiting without complaint, without accusation. She'd bought it because she'd needed somewhere to put her address, and she'd never fully moved in because there was always another deployment, another assignment, another operation, another mountain. She was aware of this.
She was aware that the house was evidence of a category of life she had been adjacent to for 14 years without quite living inside it. Mercer's proposal was in her email. Had been for 3 weeks. She hadn't answered it. She kept making notes.
The call came from Noah at 1900 his time, which made it 1700 her time, and she answered it because the number was in her phone under his name, and she had put it there after the debrief in the same practical spirit that she did most things. "Pierce," she said. "Ma'am." A pause. "I wanted to let you know. I put in for the Advanced Environmental Reading course, the one that runs out of Bragg. 3-week cohort, very small." She leaned back in her chair. "I know the course. I figured you might." Another pause. "I also wanted to tell you that Chu requested the same course, same cohort, as it turns out." She looked at the curriculum document on her table, opened to page 31, margins filled with her handwriting. "How do you know?" "He called me," Noah said, 2 days ago. We talked for a while." "About?" "The mission, the miss, what comes after." A pause. "He's going to be fine." "I know he is," she said. "I told him that." "You told him the report was harder than the shot," Noah said. "That's not the same as telling him he'll be fine. That's telling him what to do with the fact of the miss. It's more useful." She was quiet for a moment. "How's your data book?" He made a sound that might have been a short laugh. "Got 3 new entries since I landed. The mission, the debrief, and..." He paused. "A few other things I was working out." "Good." "The entry on position 3, he said. "I wrote about being uncertain, about making the adjustment without certainty." "That's honest." "Yeah." A pause that had the quality of someone deciding whether to say the next thing. He said it. "I wrote that I don't think it's certainty with you either. On the southern approach, on the shot. I don't think you were certain." She looked at the window. Outside, the late afternoon light was doing specific things to the yard. The way light did specific things in late afternoon, particular and unrepeatable. "What makes you say that?" "You sat with the porthole on the aircraft for a long time after we lifted," he said. "Certain people don't do that. People who've accepted the outcome do." She was quiet. "Am I wrong?" he said. "No," she said. "You're not wrong." "Then what is it? If it's not certainty?" She thought about how to say it. "It's the decision to act on the best available read without waiting for certainty that isn't coming," she said. "Certainty is a weather condition. It shows up sometimes. When it doesn't, you work with what you have." She paused. "The porthole is what happens when you've been running on the best available read and the adrenaline stops and you get to sit with what it cost." "And that's survivable," he said. "That's what you'd have told Chu." "Yes," she said. "That's what you'd tell anyone." "Anyone worth telling," she said. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, "Mercer's proposal, the program director role, are you going to take it?" She looked at the curriculum on the table. 31 pages of her handwriting in the margins. "I haven't decided," she said. "But you're thinking about it." "I'm making notes," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could almost hear him processing that the way he processed things. The unhurried, honest quality of his attention that had been visible since the first morning, when he'd looked at her the way people looked at questions rather than interruptions. "The notes," he said. "Are they in the data book or on something else?" She looked at the curriculum again. The cover page, the handwriting, the 31 pages. "Something else," she said. "That's different," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." They talked for another 10 minutes about nothing consequential. The logistics of the advanced course, the timing, a brief exchange about the desert heat at Iron Mesa that neither of them had missed enough to discuss at length. Then he said he had to go, and she said fine, and he said, before the line went quiet, "Ma'am, thank you for choosing me." She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment after the call ended. Not long. Just the small pause that went with the end of a conversation that had been honest, which was a specific kind of pause that felt different from the ones that didn't. Then she picked up the pencil. She turned to page 32 to 6 months after the operation, Iron Mesa's Advanced Sniper program ran its first curriculum revision in 3 years. The revision was authored jointly. a colonel who had spent 6 months reading his own program's foundation documents with new eyes, and a chief warrant officer who had spent the same 6 months making notes and margins and sitting with Mercer's proposal until sitting with it became less honest than answering it. The revised curriculum kept everything that was right. It corrected the places where the doctrine had drifted from its source material in the adaptation. It added 3 new sections: environmental reading methodology, multivariable wind analysis, and a section titled simply Post-Engagement Accounting, which addressed what operators did with their experience after the trigger was pulled, and why that processing was as tactically significant as the preparation that preceded it. The curriculum didn't carry Evelyn Cross's name anywhere in its text. It didn't carry the call sign. It was a program document, classified at the appropriate level, teaching what it taught to the people who needed to learn it. But the handwriting in the margins of the original was still there, in the copy Hale kept in his desk drawer. Small, precise, the specific vocabulary of a person who had learned things by doing them in the dark, in the cold, at ranges that most people's equipment couldn't reliably measure. He looked at it sometimes. When the program threw up something he hadn't seen before, when a selection decision wasn't obvious, when he needed to remember what the ceiling above his current understanding actually looked like from the outside, how high it was, how real, and how definitively it could be moved by the decision to open the envelope instead of pointing at the gate. Noah Pierce ran 3 more deployments in the following 2 years. Each one added entries to his data book. Each entry was honest. The hits, the misses, the adjustments, the moments of uncertainty, and the decisions made in the middle of them. He cross-referenced his data book against the Iron Mesa curriculum twice a year, the way a navigator cross-references a chart against the actual coast, looking for the places where the map and the territory had developed disagreements. Chu qualified for the Advanced Environmental Reading course and finished first in his cohort. He sent Noah a message that said, "You were right, just that." Noah wrote back, "I know, keep the book." Chu kept the book. Evelyn Cross took Mercer's proposal. She took it with conditions. She would maintain a limited field advisory role. She would continue to run selections personally, and she would keep the data book, which was not a condition she needed to state because no one was going to tell her to stop. She moved a few more things into the house outside Fayetteville. Not much, enough to indicate intention. She ran the first advanced selection course under the new curriculum in early spring. She sat on a concrete block at the edge of a range in Nevada and watched 43 operators try to solve a problem. The environment had no intention of making easy, and she watched who looked at their data and concluded the environment was wrong, and she watched who looked at the data and went looking for what they were missing. She was not hard to find between evolutions if you knew where to look. She was the one watching the air, not the targets, not the shooters, the air. Real legends don't walk into a room demanding to be recognized. They walk in carrying the work, all of it, the years of it, the dark and the cold and the misses and the adjustments and the data books filled in the honest language of people who learn things the only way things are actually learned. They set it down, quietly, where it can be used, and then they go back to work. Because the greatest thing you can leave behind is not a reputation. It is a room full of people who know something they didn't know before you arrived, and who are already teaching it to someone else.